Gerald Holloway snatched the payment from the rancher's hand before his sister could even straighten up from the fence post she'd been mending all morning. Beatrice had spent 3 hours working that Mustang, 3 hours of sweat and patience and quiet talk. And now the rancher was pressing coins into her brother's palm like she wasn't standing right there, covered in dust and horsehair, breathing hard. "Pleasure doing business," Gerald said, pocketing every cent without blinking. The rancher glanced at Beatrice once, just once, the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he's already forgotten about. She didn't say a word. She never did. But her hands curled around the fence rail until her knuckles went white. If you've ever watched someone take credit for work that wasn't theirs, if you've ever been the person in the room that nobody sees, then stay with us. Because this woman's story is about to go somewhere nobody in Pine Crossing ever expected. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button so more people can find stories like this one. Drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Beatrice. The morning Gerald sold her work started like every other morning in Pine Crossing, with Beatrice already awake before the sun touched the ridgeline, already dressed, already moving toward the barn, while the rest of the household slept. She was 26 years old and had been managing the Holloway horses since she was 14, the year their father's back gave out permanently and someone had to keep the operation from collapsing. Gerald was 4 years older and had done approximately nothing useful in the 12 years since. He collected opinions, told stories in the saloon, and occasionally showed up at the paddock fence to watch Beatrice work so he could describe what she'd done to whoever was listening. The Holloway place sat at the eastern edge of Pine Crossing, where the flat grazing land started to bunch up toward the foothills. It wasn't much. A 2-room house, a decent barn, 4 paddocks in varying states of repair, and whatever horses were passing through at any given time. Gerald made money brokering horses he didn't train. Beatrice trained them and received room and board in exchange, which Gerald considered generous. She had never once told him otherwise, which was either patience or defeat, and some mornings she wasn't sure which. The Mustang she'd been working that week was a Grullo gelding, maybe 6 years old, with a scar along his left shoulder from some old wire encounter and eyes that said he had never once trusted a human being and wasn't planning to start. The rancher who'd brought him wanted the animal broke enough to use for trail work. 3 previous men had tried, 1 had quit. 2 had been thrown badly enough that they'd limped away without asking for their money back, which told Beatrice everything she needed to know about their methods. She didn't use those methods. She started by simply existing near him. Standing at the fence, reading the horse the way another person might read a book, watching which ear tracked her, how his weight shifted when she stepped left versus right, what sounds made his nostrils flare versus what sounds settled him down. She did this for 2 full days before she ever entered the paddock. Gerald came out on the second afternoon and leaned on the fence beside her. "He still won't let you near him?" he said. "I haven't tried yet. Rancher's getting impatient." "Then the rancher can come try himself." Gerald made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You know you could just—" He gestured vaguely at the horse, meaning she should do something faster and more visible so he'd have something to report. "I know what I'm doing," she said, and went back to watching. On the 3rd morning, she entered the paddock. The gelding moved to the far end immediately, put his hindquarters toward her, which was a message she'd been expecting. She didn't follow. She stood in the center and looked at the ground, which was the opposite of what every man who'd ever tried to break a horse believed you should do. And within 20 minutes, the animal's curiosity had defeated his suspicion, and he was standing 3 feet from her left shoulder, sniffing the air near her collar. She didn't touch him. She just stood there a little longer and then walked away. Gerald, watching from outside, called out, "That's it? You just walked away?" "Yes," she said. "That's not breaking a horse, Bea." "No," she agreed. "It's not." By the morning of day 6, the Grullo gelding was accepting a halter without argument and walking beside her on a lead line with the relaxed attention of an animal that had decided this particular human was worth paying attention to. He wasn't finished. He'd need weeks more work before he was genuinely reliable on trail. But he was started, which was what the rancher had paid for. That was the morning Gerald took the money. The rancher came to collect his horse and handed over the payment right there at the fence, and Gerald stepped forward before the rancher could look around for Beatrice and said, "Much appreciated. Pleasure doing business." And that was that. Beatrice watched it from inside the barn doorway. She was close enough to hear every word and far enough that neither man looked her direction. The rancher loaded his horse, made some comment about how his last animal from this place had worked out well, and drove off. Gerald pocketed the coins and walked toward the house without looking back. She stood in the barn doorway for a long moment. The barn was cool and smelled of hay and horses, and the particular dusty darkness that she associated with the only place she'd ever felt completely herself. The Grullo had been good work. She was proud of it, in the private way she was proud of most things. Quietly, with nobody watching. She picked up a pitchfork and went back to mucking stalls. This was her life. She had, over the years, developed a way of not thinking too hard about it. Pine Crossing was not a cruel town, exactly. It was simply a town that had decided what it thought about Beatrice Holloway around the time she turned 17 and started filling out in ways that made people uncomfortable, and it had not revisited that decision since. By 26, she was large enough that the women at the dry goods store sometimes fell quiet when she walked in, and the men at the feed supply spoke to her in the particular careful tone people use with children and dogs. Patient and slightly condescending, waiting for the interaction to be over. She stood close to 300 pounds. She was also 5 feet 9 inches tall, with hands that could grip a fence post so hard the wood creaked, and shoulders that had pulled a cart out of the mud single-handed when Gerald's horse couldn't manage it. She was not soft. She was dense with muscle wrapped in something else, and the something else was what people saw first and thought about exclusively. The Holloway Ranch had 2 hired hands, a pair of brothers named Clem and Pete Daly, who had worked for the family since before Beatrice's father's back gave out. Clem was 40-something and reliable. Pete was younger and tended to notice things. Pete found her in the stall closest to the back wall an hour after Gerald collected the rancher's payment. "He take the whole amount?" Pete asked. "Yes." "Didn't even—" Pete stopped, started again. "You trained that horse for 6 days straight. I know how long I trained him. That's your money, B." She kept working. "It's how things are done here." Pete made the kind of frustrated sound men make when they can see something wrong happening clearly and feel helpless to stop it. He leaned against the stall door. "One of these days you're going to—" "Pete." "What?" "Go check the fence on the north paddock. I saw a loose post this morning." He went, grumbling. She didn't watch him go. She kept her eyes on the work in front of her and applied the same patient discipline she used on difficult horses. Feel the thing, acknowledge it's there, and keep moving. Getting angry at Gerald had never changed anything, and she'd run out of steam for it somewhere around age 20. Now she just worked. What she had never told anyone, not Pete, not Clem, not the women in town who occasionally tried to befriend her out of pity, was that she had been saving money for 3 years. Not much. Gerald ran the household accounts, and what little income the ranch generated went through his hands first. But there were side arrangements. A rancher over in Coulter who paid her directly to assess horses he was considering buying. A woman out on the Pratt Road who had a difficult mare nobody could figure out, and paid Beatrice in eggs and smoked meat, which she traded in town for cash. $22 and some cents, folded inside a handkerchief, tucked under a loose board in the barn floor. She didn't know exactly what she was saving for. She knew it was for a way. The second thing happened 4 days after the rancher collected his horse. A man rode into Pine Crossing on a gray mountain horse that was built differently from the animals most people kept in the valley. Heavier boned, with a broader chest and hindquarters that suggested it was used to climbing rather than running flat. The horse moved like it was thinking about each step, which Beatrice noticed from across the street before she noticed the man on its back. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a sack of flowers she'd been sent to collect, and she stopped at the edge of the boardwalk and looked at that horse for a moment longer than was probably polite. The man dismounted in front of the feed supply. It was not someone she'd seen before, which in a town the size of Pine Crossing was notable. He was roughly her height, but narrower. Lean in the particular way of men who work physically in cold weather, where there's no fat because the body can't afford it, but the muscle is dense and functional. His jacket was heavy canvas, worn at the elbows, and he moved with the unhurried attention of someone who was used to being alert in places where inattention had consequences. He tied the gray horse and went inside. Beatrice kept walking. She did not think about him again until that evening when Gerald came home from the saloon with the particular excited energy he got when there was gossip worth distributing. "Man came through town today," Gerald said, helping himself to the supper she'd left on the stove. "From up in the Frostback Range, horse breeder, name's Voss. Rowan Voss." Beatrice was sitting at the table going through a logbook she kept of the horses that had passed through the ranch, or weights, temperaments, any health issues she'd noticed. She didn't look up. "He's looking to buy broodmares," Gerald continued. 3 or 4. Mountain bloodlines if he can get them. Otherwise any animal with good bone and temperament. Beatrice said. "He's also—" Gerald paused in a way that meant he was deciding how to say something. "He's looking for a wife." Beatrice looked up. "So I hear," Gerald added quickly, "from Delmon at the feed supply. Apparently he made it fairly plain that he was looking for both horses and a woman, practical-like, someone who could actually survive up there. Not a, not a delicate type." "That right," Beatrice said. "I'm just telling you what I heard." She went back to her logbook. Her face was entirely neutral, which was a skill she'd had a long time. Gerald ate his supper and talked about other things. She stopped listening and thought about the gray mountain horse with its broad chest and careful step, and the man who'd ridden it. She did not allow herself to think about what Gerald had said, not the part that mattered. She had rules about that sort of thing. Thinking too hard about things you couldn't have was a particular kind of suffering she'd learned to avoid. But she thought about the horse. Rowan Voss spent 2 days in Pine Crossing, moving through the town methodically, looking at horses that were offered to him and declining most of them with polite firmness. Word got around quickly, because word always got around quickly in Pine Crossing, and by the second morning there were 3 or 4 ranch owners who had trotted out animals they considered their best in hopes of a sale. Beatrice heard about each of these transactions secondhand. A chestnut gelding he'd looked at and shaken his head over. Too narrow in the chest, she thought, when Pete described it. A gray mare someone offered that he'd walked away from entirely. Bad hocks, probably, though she couldn't be sure without seeing the animal herself. On the second afternoon, she was working in the far paddock with a young horse Gerald had taken in as partial payment on a debt. A bay colt about 18 months old with too much nervous energy and not enough focus. She was running him on a long line, getting him used to moving in circles without trying to pull away, when she heard the sound of someone at the fence. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on the colt, because looking away at the wrong moment would undo 20 minutes of patient work. The colt completed his circle. She adjusted the line, asked him to change direction. "He's moving off his left hind," a voice said. She did look then. Rowan Voss was standing at the paddock fence with his forearms resting on the top rail, watching the colt with the focused, impersonal attention of someone assessing rather than admiring. "I know," she said. "Old soft tissue thing, not serious. He compensates when he's tired." "How long you had him?" 3 weeks. He watched the colt circle again. "He's going to be a good horse." "Yes," she agreed. "He is." Voss looked at her then. She'd been aware of it coming, the moment when he'd register what he was actually looking at, the full picture, and either look away quickly or do the careful, polite non-reaction that people performed when they were trying to be decent about something they found surprising. He did neither. He just looked at her the way he'd been looking at the colt, assessing, with no particular emotion attached to it. "You the one that started that gruelo for the Fenner Ranch?" he asked. "Word travels," she said. "Fenner told me when I went to look at his stock, said the horse was started cleaner than anything he'd seen in 5 years and asked where he'd had the work done." He paused. "Holloway was the name he gave me." "Gerald Holloway's my brother," she said. "This is his ranch." "But you did the work." It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it like one. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, watching the colt again. "I came in looking at the stock people were showing me. Nothing I've seen so far is right for the mountains. Too fine-boned, most of them. One mare had a decent build, but she was head-shy, and that's not something you want 1,000 feet up in a snowstorm." "No," Beatrice agreed. "It's not. I heard you might have some mountain-bred stock." "We have 2, she said. "A mare and a half-draft cross that's mountain on his dam side. They're not for sale, technically. Gerald hasn't listed them. But you could look." He pushed off the fence and said, "I'd appreciate that." She brought the colt in, handed him off to Pete with instructions, and walked Voss to the back pasture where the two mountain-bred animals grazed. She watched him look at them the way she'd watch anyone look at a horse. Not their face, but their hands, and where their eyes went first, and how long they stayed on the feet versus the back versus the neck. He knew what he was looking at. That much was immediately clear. "The mare's got good feet," he said, crouching to examine her left front, solid through the pastern. "She's also got the best cold weather coat I've seen on an animal this size," Beatrice said. "Dense undercoat. She barely grew a blanket weight of extra hair last winter, and she was comfortable down to the kind of temperatures that had our other horses huddled." "How's her temperament in close quarters? Long winter with stalls and limited movement?" "Steady. Bore's easy if she doesn't have work, but she doesn't get mean about it. She'll make noise, not trouble." He stood up and looked at the mare for another moment. Then he said, without turning to look at Beatrice, "You're not the ranch owner." "No." "Is your brother going to negotiate, or is he going to try to sell me something else entirely while I'm talking to him?" She was quiet for a moment. "Probably the second one." He did look at her then. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite anything she had a clean word for. "Thought so," he said. Gerald was in the house when they came back, and his face when he saw who was with Beatrice was a complicated thing. Pleased at the potential sale, uncertain about what conversation had already happened without him, working out quickly how to insert himself into a situation he hadn't managed from the beginning. He was good at that, Gerald. He could read a room fast. "Mr. Voss," he said, coming forward with his hand out. "Gerald Holloway, I hear you've been looking at some of our stock." "Your sister showed me the two in the back pasture," Voss said. "I'd like to discuss terms on the mare." Gerald smiled. Of course. Come inside. I'll get the logbook," she said, before he could tell her to get coffee or disappear. "He'll want the breeding records." Gerald blinked. He'd been about to say something else, but she walked past him into the house and found the logbook and brought it out and handed it directly to Voss, who took it and looked through it with the careful attention of a man who knew how to read one. "Good record keeping," he said. "B does the logs," Gerald said, in a tone that suggested this was a minor domestic detail. Voss looked at Beatrice. "Your work?" "Yes," she said. They negotiated for an hour. Gerald did most of the talking. Beatrice corrected him 3 times. Once about the mare's age, once about her last breeding, once about a health note in the record that Gerald misread. Each time she corrected him, there was a brief uncomfortable pause, and then the conversation continued. Voss agreed to a price for the mare. He shook Gerald's hand. Then he looked at Beatrice and said, "I'd like to speak with you separately, if that's agreeable." Gerald's expression went through several things very quickly. She works the horses. She doesn't—" "Separately," Voss said again, in a tone that wasn't rude but wasn't flexible. Gerald left. He wasn't happy about it, which Beatrice filed away as something she'd pay for later, but he left. Voss sat down on the paddock fence and looked at her for a moment in that same direct assessment-level way. She stood a few feet away with her arms crossed, not defensive exactly, just occupying her body the way she always did, solidly, without apology. "I was told in town that you're not married," he said. "No." "I'm looking for a wife," he said. "I assume you heard that." "I heard." "The Frostback Range is not a comfortable place to live," he said. "Winters are serious. The work is physical. A woman who came up there expecting comfort or society would be miserable inside of a season." "I don't require either of those things," Beatrice said. "I watched you work that colt this afternoon. Before that I heard what Fenner said about the Grullo. I looked through your logbook." He paused. "You know horses." "Yes," she said. "I do." "I need someone who can manage the breeding program when I'm out working the range," he said. "Someone who can make decisions about the stock without waiting for me to come back and tell them what to do. Someone who can handle an emergency without falling apart." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not looking for decoration." Something tightened in her chest. Not a bad thing. Something more like a door she'd stopped expecting to open suddenly having a handle on it. "You don't know me," she said carefully. "I know enough to ask," he said. "The rest is a conversation." "People in this town will tell you I'm not—" She stopped. She was not going to explain herself to this man in terms of what other people thought of her. She was better than that. She started again. "I'm not what most men are looking for." I told you what I'm looking for, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. The mare in the back pasture made a sound and one of the other horses answered. The late afternoon light was doing something interesting with the dust in the air, turning it gold. If I left here, she said slowly, I would not be coming back. I understand that. And if it didn't work, if after a season you decided it was a mistake, same would apply if you decided it, he said. I'm proposing a partnership, not a purchase. If it doesn't work for either of us, we figure out what comes next. But I don't make decisions carelessly. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't serious. She thought about the $22 under the barn floor. She thought about Gerald's hand closing around the rancher's coins that morning, 4 days ago, not even looking at her while he did it. She thought about the Grullo gelding and 6 days of patient work, and the moment when the horse had finally lowered his head and breathed out and decided she was someone worth trusting. All right, she said. Voss nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already known. I'll speak with your brother about the arrangements, he said. We'll leave the day after tomorrow, early. Gerald will want, she started. Your brother can want whatever he likes, Voss said. He doesn't own you. She stood there after he walked toward the house, listening to the horses in the back pasture and the distant sound of town settling toward evening. Her heart was doing something irregular. Her hands were steady. She went to the barn, lifted the loose board, counted the $22 in change, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she went to pack. She didn't have much. A working woman in a household that treated her as staff rather than family tends not to accumulate things. It's too painful to own objects in a place where you have no real claim to space. She had her logbooks, because she'd bought them herself. She had 2 changes of clothing. She had a good pair of gloves her father had given her the year before he died. She had the contents of the loose board. Gerald found her in her room with a canvas bag on the bed. What did he say to you? Gerald demanded. He'd clearly been working himself up since Voss went to speak with him about the arrangements. His face was flushed, and his jaw was set the way it got when he felt things were happening without his permission. He asked me to marry him, Beatrice said, folding a shirt. I said yes. You can't just… Gerald stopped, reorganized. He's a stranger. He lives in the mountains. You don't know anything about him. I know he can read a logbook, she said. That's more than most. This is ridiculous. Gerald planted himself in the doorway. You're going off with a man you met this afternoon because he… What? Complimented your horse records? More or less, she said. His voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but doing something she recognized as Gerald trying to find an angle that would work. I need you here. The horses. You know I can't manage the horses without you. You've been telling people you manage them for 12 years, she said. I expect you'll figure it out. His face went red. That's not… I've supported you. I've given you room and board, she said, in exchange for doing every piece of work that keeps this ranch operating. It's been a fair trade, Gerald. I'm not angry at you for it. She was a little angry. She kept that part quiet. But I'm going. He doesn't know what he's getting, Gerald said, and there was something ugly in it now, the angle he'd finally found. He's seen you work horses. He hasn't looked at you the way a husband looks at a wife. When the novelty wears off. Enough, she said. It was a quiet word. She didn't raise her voice. She hadn't raised her voice at Gerald in so long she'd forgotten the last time, because raising her voice had never once changed anything, and quiet endurance had at least the advantage of not exhausting her. But she looked at him, directly, and something in her face made him stop. I'm going, she said. The day after tomorrow. You can sell the mare Voss paid for, or you can keep her. That's your business. The bay colt needs another 6 weeks of line work before anyone puts weight on him, and the fence on the north paddock has a loose post Pete already knows about. She picked up her bag and set it by the wall. I'm going to sleep now. Don't make this into something ugly. Gerald stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he left. She lay down on her bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the barn sounds through the wall. The horses moving, the particular creak of the old wood settling in the evening cool, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could name. Not happiness. Too big a word? Too neat. More like a crack in something that had been sealed for years, and air coming through it. She was afraid. She wanted to be clear-eyed about that. She was going into the mountains with a man she'd known for an afternoon, leaving the only work she'd ever had, going towards something she couldn't see the shape of. The fear was real, and she didn't pretend otherwise. But the fear sat next to something else, something that had woken up in her chest when Voss had said, "I'm not looking for decoration," with the same tone he'd used to describe what he needed in a broodmare. Practical, specific, already certain of what he valued. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that. Not with those particular words. Like her actual self, the competent and physical and capable self, was exactly what was wanted. She had $22. She had her logbooks and her gloves and a canvas bag. She had a man who'd read her breeding records and decided she was worth asking. It wasn't much. She'd worked with less. The morning they left, Gerald didn't come out to say goodbye. Pete Daly came to the barn while she was saddling her horse. A stout sorrel mare she'd been using for years, technically Gerald's horse, but one Gerald never rode and couldn't ride, and stood there with his hat in his hands looking like he was trying to find words for something he'd been thinking for a long time. "You're doing the right thing," Pete said finally. "I might be doing the foolish thing," she said. "Those aren't always different. He seems like a decent man." She thought about that. "He seems like an honest one. That's enough to start with." Pete handed her something, a small folded piece of paper. "Clem and me put that together for, I don't know, for whatever." She unfolded it. $7 and some change. She looked at him. "Don't make it a thing," Pete said, going red. "Just, you earned it here, more than you ever collected." She put the money in her pocket with the $22 and the coins. She didn't make it a thing. But she put her hand on Pete's shoulder for a moment, which was the closest she came to telling him what it meant. Rowan Voss was waiting at the edge of town with the gray mountain horse and the mare he'd bought from Gerald. The latter fitted with a lead line, his gear packed with the organized efficiency of a man who'd done this kind of traveling a great many times. He had another pack horse, a sturdy brown gelding loaded with supplies, and he'd looked at Beatrice's sorrel when she rode up with the assessing look she was already starting to recognize as his standard greeting for any horse. "She'll manage the climb," Beatrice said. "I wasn't worried," he said, which might have been true or might have been courtesy. She couldn't tell yet. They rode out of Pine Crossing on a cold, clear morning, the mountains showing above the tree line to the north, white-capped and indifferent. Nobody came out to watch them go. Or maybe someone did and Beatrice didn't look back to check. She did not look back. The road north ran through good flat country for the first 10 miles, familiar ground she'd ridden 100 times on various ranch errands, and for that stretch she was comfortable. Voss rode without much conversation, which she didn't mind. She'd spent enough years working in quiet barns with animals who had no interest in filling silence with talk to find silence entirely natural. He spoke, though, when he spoke at all, in direct sentences. He told her about the ranch as they rode, where it sat in the range, how many horses they ran in summer versus winter, what the winters actually looked like, practical information delivered without embellishment. She asked questions when she had them. He answered them the same way he'd asked her to marry him, completely, without hedging. Around midday, they stopped at a creek to water the horses, and she sat on a rock and ate the biscuits she'd packed and watched the way he checked each animal's feet before remounting, working through them in a specific order that told her something about how his mind organized tasks. "How many horses did you lose last winter?" she asked. He looked up. "One foal. Wasn't viable from the start. Everything else came through." "What's your current breeding setup?" he told her. She listened carefully, asking a follow-up here and there, building a picture in her mind of the operation she was riding toward. It was larger than she'd expected. 40-some horses at peak summer population, down to 20-odd in winter once he sold the year's output. A program focused on mountain-hardy working stock, not flash animals, bred for bone and temperament, and cold tolerance over speed or looks. "Your lead stallion," she said. "How's his temperament with new mares?" "Manageable," Voss said. "He's an opinionated animal, but not dangerous." "What does opinionated look like?" Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. "He lets you know when he disagrees with your decisions." "So does every horse I've worked with worth working with," she said. That time it was closer to a smile. They crossed into the foothills in the early afternoon, where the trail started climbing and the character of the land changed. Steeper, rockier, the trees shifting from the broad-crowned valley cottonwoods to tighter-growing conifers that pressed close to the trail on both sides. The sorrel mare changed her movement, shifting her weight back slightly, shortening her stride to deal with the slope, which was exactly correct, and Beatrice felt the adjustment under her with satisfaction. The pack horse, the brown gelding, was loaded heavy, wintering supplies mostly, plus some equipment Voss had picked up in town. On a steep section of trail where the switchback was tight and the footing loose shale, the gelding's hindquarters slipped. It happened fast. One moment they were working through a tricky section, and the next the gelding had gone sideways toward the canyon edge, his back legs scrambling for purchase, and the weight of the packs was pulling him wrong, and Voss was off his horse instantly and grabbing the lead, but the gelding was 400 pounds heavier than him, and the slope was working against any human trying to hold the animal upright through arm strength alone. Beatrice was off her horse before she'd consciously decided to move. She didn't grab the lead. She moved to the gelding's uphill side and planted her boots into a crack in the shale. There was a seam in the rock she could feel through her sole, and she put her shoulder against the gelding's side and pushed. Not wild pushing, not panicked. She found the angle where her body weight and the mountain's geometry worked together, leaned into it with everything she had, and held. The gelding stopped sliding. He scrambled. His front feet found something solid. Voss pulled the lead from the front, and Beatrice kept the pressure steady from the side, and the animal came up onto level ground with a lurch that nearly took her off her feet, except she'd already recalculated her stance, and she caught herself on the rock face with one hand and stood up straight. The gelding stood on the trail, breathing hard. She ran her hands down his legs quickly. Nothing wrong, no injury, just scared. Rowan Voss was looking at her. She looked back. "Good seam in the rock right there," she said, pointing to where she'd planted her feet. He was quiet for a long moment. He was doing the math, she could tell. She'd felt him do it while they were holding the horse. The moment when he'd understood that the weight that kept her anchored was the same weight the town had made her feel ashamed of for 15 years. "Yes," he said finally. "Good eye." They went on up the mountain. The trail steepened another 3 miles before it leveled onto a broader ridge, and by the time the homestead came into sight in the late afternoon, a solid 2-story structure of heavy timber, a barn that looked newer and larger than the house, several paddocks fanning out across a south-facing slope. The temperature had dropped enough that Beatrice could see her breath. The ranch looked nothing like what she'd been unconsciously picturing. It looked like work, not in a defeated way, in the way that a well-used tool looks, slightly worn but functional, every part of it present because it was needed. The barn was built with the mountains in mind, lower profile against wind, the doors facing away from the prevailing weather. The paddock fences were heavy post construction, not the lighter rail fencing you'd use in valley country where you didn't have to worry about 6 feet of snow pressing down on everything. Someone had thought carefully about how things worked up here. She looked at Rowan Voss riding ahead of her and understood, more clearly than she had in town, that she was looking at the evidence of someone's serious attention to a serious problem. "Who built the barn?" she asked. "I did," he said, "over 2 winters. The angled roof on the east side," she said. "That's for snow shedding. Loses less heat that way, too," he said. "Took me a season to figure that out." They rode in as the light was going gold on the western peaks, and she sat on her horse at the edge of the yard and looked at the mountains above her, closer now, pressing down in a way that was not threatening but not gentle either, just present, enormous and indifferent to her existence, and thought, this is the kind of place that will tell you exactly what you're worth. Not the town's version of worth, not Gerald's, not anyone else who'd looked at her and made a fast decision and looked away. The mountain's version, which only counts one thing. She dismounted and started untacking her horse and thought about the colt in the back pasture at home. Back there, she corrected herself, at Gerald's, and the Grullo gelding and the mare with the good cold weather coat who would go to her new owner next week. She thought about Pete and the $7 and the way he'd looked when she thanked him. She thought, this is going to be hard. She thought, I know how to do hard things. Voss came to take the sorrel's lead and said, I'll show you the barn. She said, I'd like that. They walked toward the barn together in the early mountain dark, and the horses moved around them, and somewhere up the slope one of the herd animals called out and was answered by another, and it sounded to Beatrice Holloway. Beatrice Voss, she supposed, or would be soon enough, like something that had been waiting for her to arrive. She wasn't ready to call it home yet, but she was ready to learn its language, and she had always been very good at that. The barn was the first place she understood what she'd agreed to. Not the house, which was spare and functional, and told her mainly that Rowan Voss did not spend much time indoors if he could avoid it. Not the yard, which in the last of the evening light looked like any working ranch yard, gear hung and stacked and organized with the particular logic of a man who lived alone and had worked out his own system. The barn was where it became real, because the barn was where the horses were, and horses don't perform for newcomers the way people do. She stood in the entrance and let her eyes adjust and counted 14 animals in the stalls and run-in areas visible from where she stood, and she could already feel the particular attention of each one. Some curious, some indifferent, a few that shifted away from her presence with the wariness of animals that had learned not to extend trust quickly. Voss came up behind her and said, "Take your time." She walked the length of the barn slowly, not touching, not speaking to the horses yet, just moving through and reading the room the way she always did. Who was comfortable, who was tense, which animals were on good terms with their neighbors, and which were working hard to ignore each other. It took about 10 minutes. Voss stood at the entrance and let her do it without commentary, which she noted. When she came back to where he was standing, she said, "The bay in the third stall. He's been fighting his neighbor." Voss looked. They've been next to each other for 2 seasons. Something changed recently. He's got a tension pattern in his neck that's about anticipating something coming from the left. New horse? Anything shift in the barn rotation? It was quiet a moment. Moved a mare into the far end about 6 weeks ago. She's in season still, off and on. That's it, Beatrice said. He can hear her, can't see her, can't do anything about it, and he's taking it out on his neighbor when the neighbor moves into his space. She considered. Swap him 2 stalls left. Closer to the mare, he'll settle once he can actually assess the situation instead of just reacting to sound. Voss looked at her for a moment with the same expression he'd had on the trail when she'd stopped the pack horse, doing math. "I'll do it tomorrow morning," he said. They moved the horses that needed moving and settled the ones that were already settled, and by the time they came out of the barn, the sky was fully dark and cold in the sharp, clear way of high elevation, where there was nothing between you and the sky to soften it. The stars were remarkable. She'd heard people talk about mountain stars, but hadn't understood what they meant until she was standing there with the cold pressing down and the peaks around her blocking the horizon on 3 sides, and the sky overhead doing something she didn't have a word for. She stood there for a minute longer than was practical. "Kitchen's warm," Voss said. She went inside. The kitchen was the heart of the house in the way that barns are the heart of ranches. The place where the actual living happened, evidence of regular use, a wood stove with a particular smell of pine resin and old iron, a table with 2 chairs, shelves with provisions organized in the unsentimental way of someone who needed to know where things were without thinking about it. She sat down and he put coffee on and they sat across the table from each other in the quiet. And it was strange, she thought, being in a kitchen with a man who was going to be her husband, with the entire unfamiliar mountain pressing around the walls, and having it feel less frightening than she'd expected. Not comfortable exactly, just not the wrong shape. "There'll be a preacher through in about 3 weeks, he said. "Fellow named Marsh who does the circuit through the valley settlements. If you want to make it formal before then, we'd have to ride down." 3 weeks is fine, she said. He nodded. "You'll have the back room. I built it as a 2nd bedroom originally, figured it would be useful one way or another." "All right," she said. He poured the coffee. He didn't fill her cup and then fill his own the way Gerald always had, reaching across without asking. He set the pot on the table between them and let her pour her own, which was such a small thing that she felt slightly ridiculous for noticing it. She noticed it anyway. "Tell me about the stallion," she said. "The opinionated one." Rowan leaned back in his chair and she could see him deciding how honest to be about the animal, doing the calibration that people do when they're not sure yet how much the other person can handle. Then apparently he decided she could handle it because he said, "His name is Garnet. He's 11 years old. Best conformation I've ever bred, and the most difficult horse I have ever personally dealt with in my life." "Difficult how?" "Smart difficult," he said. "Not mean difficult. He doesn't kick or strike. What he does is figure out what you want him to do and then do something adjacent to it, just different enough to be technically wrong, and then look at you like he wants to see what you're going to do about it." She stared at him. "He argues. Constantly. And the mares accept him?" "The mares love him," Rowan said. with the slightly aggrieved tone of a man who has spent a long time being the least popular individual in a herd. He's attentive, patient, not aggressive. With the mares, he's perfectly behaved. It's humans he has opinions about. I'd like to meet him tomorrow, she said. I thought you might, he said. I'll warn you he's not going to be impressed just because you're new. Good, she said. I'm not trying to impress him. They drank their coffee. Outside, the wind had started, a low, steady sound that moved through the trees differently than valley wind did, more textured, with a particular depth that told her the range was enormous, and she was small inside it. She was not afraid of that. She was, if she was honest, something closer to relieved. The mountain didn't care what she looked like. The mountain was only interested in what she could do. She slept hard that first night and woke before light with the automatic alertness she'd had since childhood, the internal alarm of someone who'd trained herself to be up before anyone else could assign her morning tasks. It took a moment to understand the ceiling above her, not the familiar crack pattern of her room at Gerald's, but solid timber, close-grained, the kind that told her the man who'd built this had taken his time with it. She dressed and went to the barn. Garnet was in the largest stall at the far end, a liver chestnut of such remarkable proportion that she stood outside his stall door for a full 30 seconds before she said anything. He was looking at her already. He'd been looking at her since she came through the barn door, tracking her movement the way intelligent horses do. Not nervously, not defensively, but with the specific alert attention of an animal that is actively gathering information. All right, she said to the stall door rather than to him directly. I see you. He made a sound, not unfriendly, evaluative. She stood there for a while, looking at the wall beside his stall rather than at him, giving him time to look at her without the pressure of being watched. After maybe 5 minutes, she heard him shift, and then there was warm breath on her shoulder as he pushed his nose toward her. She didn't move. He blew out, sniffed, pulled back and considered. Not asking you to like me, she said, just asking you to do your job. He snorted, which she chose to interpret as provisional agreement. Rowan found her there 20 minutes later. He looked at Garnet, who was standing at his stall door with a kind of focused interest that Rowan apparently did not usually see directed at humans, and then he looked at Beatrice, and he didn't say anything for a moment. He hasn't done that with anyone, he said finally. I didn't do anything with him, she said. I just stood here. That's the thing, Rowan said. Most people who come to see him, they push. They want him to respond immediately. They take it personally when he doesn't. He feels that. Of course he does, she said. He's not stupid. They worked together that morning, moving through the barn chores with the particular awkwardness of two people figuring out each other's systems, who goes left and who goes right, at a shared task. What pace feels natural, when to hand off, and when to work parallel. It was the kind of thing you couldn't rush, the physical language of shared work, and she'd been around enough partnerships between people and animals to know it took time to get smooth. What she noticed was that he didn't instruct her. He showed her where things were when she asked, explained his reasons when she asked that too, but he didn't stand behind her tasks telling her how to do them. After years of Gerald's commentary, Gerald, who couldn't have tacked a horse correctly if his life depended on it, offering opinions on her technique, the absence of it felt unusual, good unusual, the kind of unusual she'd have to get used to. Around mid-morning, a problem announced itself in the form of a mare named Duchess. Duchess was a gray mountain mare, 6 years old, broad through the chest and hip, one of the better animals Beatrice had seen in the barn, and she was off. Not dramatically, not colicking, not injured, but standing at the back of her run-in with a posture that said something wasn't right, her weight distribution slightly wrong, eating without enthusiasm. How long has she been like this? Beatrice asked. Rowan came and looked. Yesterday she seemed fine. This morning I thought she was slower than usual, but I put it down to I wasn't sure. Beatrice went in with her. She worked through a systematic check, unhurried, hands moving methodically. Legs, gut sounds, gum color, temperature of the feet, the texture of the coat along the spine. The mare was cooperative, which told her the animal wasn't in serious pain, just uncomfortable and not herself. When did she last cycle? She asked. Rowan thought. 3 weeks, maybe 4. She's early pregnant, Beatrice said, or I'd bet on it. First trimester, the early weeks, they sometimes go off like this. Appetite dips, a little withdrawn. It passes. She ran her hand along the mare's side. She needs smaller, more frequent feeding for the next few weeks. Less bulk, easier digestion. And keep her in the run-in rather than the paddock until she's got her energy back. Not because she can't move, but because she'll make the right decision herself if you give her the option. Rowan was watching her work. You've done this before. My father had a breeding operation before his back gave out. I was 12 the first time I helped him through a problem pregnancy. She came out of the run-in and latched the gate. I don't always get it right, but I know what to watch for. He didn't say that's impressive or I didn't realize. He said, I'll adjust her feed schedule today, which was better. The first 2 weeks on the mountain had a learning curve she hadn't anticipated, not because the work was unfamiliar, but because the context changed everything. Valley ranching and mountain ranching were related the way two languages from the same family are related. You could follow the shape of things, the basic grammar, but the vocabulary was different, and the idioms didn't translate. And if you assumed you understood, you'd find yourself wrong at exactly the wrong moment. She learned what winter feed storage looked like at altitude, where you weren't just fighting cold, but fighting the weight of snow on roof lines, and the way freeze-thaw cycles cracked anything that held water. She learned which trails were reliable, at which temperatures, and which ones turned treacherous when the temperature dropped below a certain point without warning. She learned the particular personality of the frostback wind, how it came from the northwest and hit the barn's long wall first, and what sounds it made in the timber above the house when it was merely cold versus when it was announcing something serious coming behind it. She and Rowan worked out their systems. He had been a man who lived alone for a long time. She could see that in how the house was organized, the specific logic of a person who'd arranged everything to suit exactly one person's habits and needs. And she'd lived for a long time in someone else's house according to someone else's rules, which meant neither of them had particularly entrenched habits about cohabitation. They negotiated the kitchen without too much friction. They figured out that they were both early risers who preferred to work in quiet for the first hour of the day, which simplified mornings considerably. What they were still working out was everything else. There were evenings at the table where she could feel them both being careful, picking topics that stayed on work, and the horses, and the practical necessities of the ranch, steering around the larger questions that were there but didn't have an obvious way in yet. She didn't think of it as dishonesty. It was more like two people trying to move through a room in the dark. You went slowly and kept your hands out and tried not to knock anything over. I was not a man who talked about himself easily. She gathered information in pieces that he'd come to the Frostback Range 11 years ago from somewhere east, that the ranch had been derelict when he bought it, that the first 2 winters had been genuinely difficult in ways he mentioned only briefly and without elaborating. She didn't push. She understood the principle involved. 3 weeks in, Preacher Marsh rode through on his circuit, and the thing was made formal, just the 2 of them and the preacher in the front room of the house, quick and practical. The words exchanged with the seriousness of people who meant them rather than performed them. Marsh had supper with them afterward and told rambling stories about the valley settlements that were mostly funny and sometimes alarming. And she sat at the table and thought, I live here now. This is the person I'm married to. That is the view out that window for the foreseeable future. It didn't feel wrong. Wrong was the main thing she was watching for, she realized. Whether she'd made a catastrophic error, whether he was something other than what he'd presented, whether the mountain would eat her alive before she learned its rules. None of those things were happening. What was happening was harder to name. It was slow and practical and sometimes uncomfortable, and occasionally she'd catch him watching her work and not be able to read his expression, which bothered her more than she wanted to admit. The stall swap she'd suggested on the first night worked. The bay horse settled within a week of being moved, and his neighbor stopped showing stress marks in his turnout patterns, and she caught Rowan standing at the entrance to the barn one morning, looking at both horses with the expression of a man revising a calculation. You were right about the stalls, he said. He needed to know what he was dealing with, she said. You can't ask an animal to be calm about something it can't see. Give them information, and they'll usually figure out what to do with it. He was quiet for a moment. That applies to more things than horses. Yes, she said, it does. Which was the closest they'd come to talking about themselves rather than the ranch. Garnet was an ongoing negotiation. She'd established a basic working relationship with him in the first week. He would accept the halter, would lead, would tolerate grooming with only moderate commentary. But the word tolerate was doing a lot of work in that sentence. He had opinions about when activities should happen, opinions about which activities were worthwhile, opinions about the pace at which things should proceed, and he communicated all of these opinions with a frankness that she found genuinely entertaining even on the days when it complicated her work. He had a particular trick that Rowan hadn't warned her about, probably because Rowan had stopped noticing it. When you were trying to lead him somewhere he didn't want to go, he didn't resist. He walked perfectly beside you, at exactly the right pace, and simply aimed himself 3 degrees off your intended destination and maintained that angle with absolute consistency until you either corrected it or ended up somewhere other than where you'd planned. She caught it the 3rd time it happened and stopped in the middle of the yard and said, "I see what you're doing." Garnet looked at her. "That's not going to work with me," she said. He looked at the paddock gate with an expression she could only describe as thoughtful. "We're going to the round pen," she said. "I know you know where it is." She took him to the round pen and worked him for 20 minutes, nothing punishing, just consistent clarity about what she was asking. Forward, stop, change direction, stop again, until his focus had shifted from finding the angle that might redirect things to actually paying attention to her. Then she stopped and stood in the middle and let him come to her on his own terms, which he did after about 2 minutes of deliberating, and she scratched the spot behind his ear that she'd noticed him trying to reach himself against the stall door. And he leaned into it with the particular grateful pressure of an animal that has decided someone is useful to have around. "Good," she said. "We understand each other." He blew out through his nose. She took him back to his stall and found Rowan leaning on the fence outside the round pen with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "He let you scratch that spot," he said. "Yes." "He doesn't let me scratch that spot. I've tried for 4 years. She considered this. "You were probably going right for it. He doesn't like being obvious about what he wants." Rowan looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he said, "I'm going to check the north fence line, back before dark." He went. She looked at the mountains and didn't examine too closely why her chest felt the way it did. 6 weeks after she arrived, the first serious weather hit. Not the winter storm the season was building toward, that was still weeks away, but a forerunner, a 4-day system that dropped 2 feet of new snow and dropped the temperature far enough that the water troughs froze solid overnight, and 2 of the young horses in the outer paddock started showing the tight-muscled, slightly hollow posture that said they were burning through their reserves, keeping warm. She moved them into the barn before the second night, which meant redistributing the stall assignments to fit 2 extra horses into a space that was already running near capacity. It was a puzzle. Which horses could share a run-in without conflict, which ones needed their own space, or they'd work themselves into a state that was worse than the cold, where Duchess should go given her pregnancy. And she worked through it the way she worked through most things, systematically, and without rushing to the obvious answer. Rowan came in from the north fence line at mid-afternoon on the second day, looking like a man who'd been arguing with the weather for several hours and had not won. His coat was carrying an inch of snow across the shoulders, and he was moving stiffly in the way of serious cold that had gone in through the layers. And he stopped inside the barn door and looked at the rearranged situation with a moment of complete stillness. "The outer paddock horses," she said, not looking up from where she was distributing feed. "They were losing condition. I brought them in." "I see that," he said. "I used the run-in on the east end for both of them. Moved the 2 mares that were in there to the center stalls. They don't mind each other. Duchess is in the large stall now because she doesn't need to manage a paddock mate right now, and that stall has the least draft." He looked at the horses as she described each decision, following the logic. "The east run-in," he said. "Those 2 always—" "They have a fight if they're in there more than 4 hours," she said. "I know. I'll swap one of them out when you warm up. There's a mare in the second paddock that the gray gets along with. I need to know which path is clearest to get her in." He pointed her toward the back door route, which was sheltered from the northwest wind by the barn's angle. She went out and brought the second mare in and completed the puzzle, and then she went back inside and found Rowan standing at the stove with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, some of the cold stiffness going out of his shoulders. "That was good management," he said. "They were cold," she said. "It wasn't complicated." "That's not what I mean." He looked at her. "I mean, you saw the problem, worked out the solution, and did it without waiting for someone to tell you what to do. In conditions that weren't comfortable." He paused. "I've had hired men who couldn't manage that." She sat down at the table. "I grew up in a barn," she said. Horses in trouble look the same everywhere. Still, he said. She looked at her hands. They were chapped, the knuckles cracked from the cold, the kind of working hands that didn't photograph well but did everything that needed doing. She was aware, in a way she usually kept at a distance, of how she looked sitting at that table. Solid and weathered and nothing at all like what the women's periodicals described when they talked about wives. She was aware that Rowan was looking at her and that she didn't know, still couldn't read with any certainty, what he saw. "You don't have to tell me it was good management," she said. "I know when I've done something right." "I know you do," he said. "I wasn't complimenting your confidence. I was—" He stopped and considered his words in the careful way she'd noticed he did when he was trying to say something precise rather than just something. "I was telling you that I see you working, that I'm paying attention." She looked up. His expression was not complicated by anything performed. It was just honest, which was the thing she'd noticed about him from the first afternoon. He didn't say things to be polite, so when he said something, it meant he'd decided it was worth saying. "Thank you," she said, and meant it simply, without the defensive thickness she usually brought to anything that resembled a compliment. He nodded and drank his coffee. Outside, the storm pressed against the barn walls, and the horses settled into the particular quiet of animals that are warm and fed and have decided there's nothing currently requiring their attention. She sat across the table from the man she'd married 6 weeks ago and thought about the mountain and its version of worth, and how she was slowly beginning to understand what it asked for. It wasn't ease, it wasn't beauty or grace or any of the soft-edged virtues that the town had decided she lacked. It asked for accuracy. It asked for the ability to read a situation without sentiment and respond to what was actually there rather than what you'd hoped for. It asked you to keep moving when the cold got in through the layers, and to find the logic in a problem when everything around you was trying to obscure it, and to know the difference between what you could fix right now and what you had to wait on. She'd been doing that her whole life. She just hadn't known before that those were the exact skills the place she was going to live would value. She was finishing the last of her coffee when Rowan said, without particular weight, "That thing you said, about giving animals information so they can figure out what to do with it." She waited. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "About whether I've done that, given you the actual picture of what's here, or whether I've been careful about it." She looked at him. "There's a man named Hargrove," he said. "Ellison Hargrove. He runs a large spread about 12 miles south along the range. He's been interested in the breeding rights to garnet for 3 seasons. He paused. "Interested in the way that doesn't take no for an answer gracefully." "What kind of interested?" "Twice he's had men ride through claiming they were just checking the fence line and ending up looking at my paddocks for a lot longer than fence inspection takes. Last spring, a piece of my north grazing land came up on a county land survey with his name attached to it. Surveyor made a mistake, it was corrected, but..." He stopped. "It cost me 3 months and a lawyer I had to write to in the capital." She was quiet, following the shape of this. "He wants the stallion." "He wants the stallion, and he wants me not to be the competition I currently am," Rowan said. "His horses are showy, valley buyers like them. My horses actually work in the mountains, which is a different market and a smaller one, but it's mine, and I've built it carefully. He doesn't like that I exist." "And now there are 2 of us here instead of 1, she said. "Yes." "Does that make things better or worse for him?" Rowan looked at her steadily. "That's what I'm not certain about yet." She sat with that for a moment. The storm outside shifted, a change in the wind's direction that she felt through the walls before she heard it. "You should have told me this before we left Pine Crossing," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have." She appreciated that he didn't explain why he hadn't, didn't dress it up as protection or timing. He just said yes and let it be a thing he'd done imperfectly. "All right," she said. "I know now. What does he know about me?" "Probably what he could find out from Pine Crossing," Rowan said, "which is whatever your brother told him if he asked." That particular thought moved through her like cold water. Gerald, who knew everything about her work and nothing about how to value it, talking to a man who had 12 miles of mountain range and a habit of making problems disappear through bureaucratic friction. She thought about what Gerald would say if a well-dressed man asked him about his sister, and she thought she knew, more or less, what Gerald would say. "He'll have told him I'm not a serious person," she said, "that I worked horses because I had nothing else to do and no one to do it for me." She paused. "He won't have meant to harm me. That's just the story he tells." Rowan said nothing. He didn't argue with it, and he didn't agree with it. He just let her have the analysis. Then Hargrove doesn't know what he's dealing with, she said, which gives us some time. She got up and went to the window and looked at the dark and the snow pressing against it. Behind her, she heard Rowan set down his cup. "Beatrice," he said. She turned. "I asked you to come here because I needed someone who could manage this ranch when I couldn't manage it alone," he said. "That's true, but that's not all of it." He said it with the particular care of a man delivering information he'd been sitting on for long enough that saying it was a relief. "I want you to know that." The storm found a new register, pressing against the north wall now. One of the horses in the barn made a small sound and was quiet again. She looked at Rowan Voss across the kitchen of the house he'd built in the mountains and thought about the crack in the sealed thing that she'd felt on the night she packed her bag, the air coming through. "I know," she said. She didn't know if that was true, but she thought it might be getting there. She turned back to the window and watched the snow and thought about Ellison Hargrove 12 miles south, with his showy horses and his land survey errors that somehow always pointed in the same direction. She thought about Garnet in his stall and Duchess with her early pregnancy and the 2 young horses she'd pulled in from the cold before they lost any more condition. She thought, there is a great deal of work to do here, and most of it hasn't started yet. The storm ran 3 more days. By the time it broke and the sun came back, hard and crystalline against the fresh white of the range, she had memorized every horse in that barn, every habit and preference and particular eccentricity, every soft spot and every boundary. She had mapped the homestead in the way she mapped things she intended to keep, not just where everything was, but why it was there, how it worked, what would happen if it stopped. She stood in the barn door on the morning the weather broke and watched the horses in the nearest paddock, moving through the fresh snow with the contained pleasure of animals that had been inside too long. And she felt something she recognized belatedly as the specific form of belonging that comes not from being welcomed, but from having made yourself necessary. She hadn't asked for welcome. She'd asked for honest work in a place that valued it. The mountain, so far, was holding up its end. She went back in to start the morning feed. Ellison Hargrove rode up to the Voss homestead on a Tuesday morning in late November, 3 weeks after the Forerunner storm had cleared, with 2 men behind him and the particular ease of someone who had decided in advance that this visit was going to go the way he wanted it to. Beatrice saw him coming from the upper paddock, where she was checking the fence line after the snow load had pressed 2 posts out of true. She recognized the type before she could see his face clearly. The way he sat his horse said everything, upright in the deliberate way of men who have learned that posture communicates authority, moving at a pace that said he was not hurrying for anyone. His horse was a flashy dun, well-conformed, clearly expensive, clearly chosen to be noticed. She straightened up from the fence post and watched him come. Rowan was in the barn. She did not go get him. Hargrove pulled up in the yard and looked around at the homestead with the calculating attention of a man pricing real estate. I was older than she'd expected, late 50s maybe, with a face that had been handsome once and had moved into something harder and more deliberate. He had the rancher's build, heavy through the shoulders, and hands that had once worked but probably didn't anymore. He looked at the barn, at the paddocks, at the horses moving in the far pasture, and then he looked at Beatrice coming down from the upper fence line, and his expression did the thing she'd seen 1,000 times. The quick involuntary registration of her size, the recalibration, and then the decision about how to proceed with what he'd just registered. He decided on the slightly too friendly approach, the one where you smiled wider than you meant it to compensate for what you'd just thought. "Good morning," he said, from horseback. He didn't dismount. "I'm looking for Rowan Voss. Is he about?" "He's in the barn," she said. "I'm his wife. What's your business?" Something shifted in his expression at that. Not surprise exactly. He'd probably known about her, or known something. More like he was recalibrating again, deciding where she fit in his plan for this morning. "Ellison Hargrove," he said. "I run the Hargrove spread south along the range. Rowan and I have some ongoing business discussions." "He hasn't mentioned any outstanding discussions," she said pleasantly. His smile didn't waver. "We go back a ways. I'm sure he'll want to see me. Could you let him know I'm here?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come on down then. I'll walk you to the barn." She said it in the tone of someone doing a courtesy, which meant he had to dismount or look rude about it. He dismounted. His 2 men stayed on their horses, which she noted. They weren't coming to visit, they were waiting. She walked Hargrove to the barn at a comfortable pace, not hurrying. She was aware of him walking beside her and recalculating again, because she was taller than he'd expected, and the awareness of her physical size and actual proximity, rather than from horseback, seemed to be making him reset something. Rowan looked up when they came through the barn door. He'd been checking Duchess, who was 12 weeks along now and doing well, but bore watching. He looked at Hargrove and then at Beatrice, and his expression was completely neutral, which she'd learned meant he was not pleased. "Ellison," he said. "Rowan." Hargrove extended his hand, and they shook in the way of men who have a long, complicated history and have decided to perform civility about it. "Good to see you looking well. See you've made some changes up here." "A few," Rowan said. "I had the pleasure of meeting your wife." Hargrove glanced back at Beatrice, who had stationed herself to the left of the barn door with no particular intention of leaving. "Didn't know you'd married. Congratulations." "Thank you," Rowan said. The pleasantries settled, and Hargrove got to his actual reason. He did it with the smoothness of a man who'd been negotiating for a long time. Eased into it, mentioned the horse market, said how well things were moving in the valley this season, talked about prices with the particular enthusiasm of someone whose prices were good, and then said, "I've been thinking about that standing offer I made you last spring for the breeding rights to Garnet." "The answer is still no," Rowan said. "I've improved the terms significantly," Hargrove said. 2 seasons of breeding rights. I'm talking about serious money, Rowan, enough to put this place on entirely solid footing." "This place is already on solid footing," Rowan said. Hargrove's smile stayed in place, but something behind it shifted. "Mountain ranching's a hard life. I'd think a man in your position would welcome some financial stability." "A man in my position," Rowan repeated. "New wife, expanding operation," Hargrove said, spreading his hands reasonably. "More mouths to feed, more responsibility. The offer makes good sense right now." Beatrice watched Rowan's jaw tighten slightly, and then release. He had very good control of his face. She was getting better at reading the parts that moved a little anyway. "The breeding rights to Garnet are not for sale," Rowan said. "Not for 2 seasons, not for 1. I've told you that every time you've asked. I'm asking again because the terms have changed." Hargrove said it with the measured patience of someone who expected that persistence was eventually going to work. "Think about it. You don't need to give me an answer today." "I gave you the answer," Rowan said. "It doesn't change with better terms." Hargrove looked at Beatrice then. It was a deliberate look, the kind that was making a point rather than making contact. "Your wife seemed like the type who'd want to stay comfortable up here," he said to Rowan about her, while she was standing right there. "Mountain winters are hard on folks not used to them." Beatrice said, "I'm from ranch stock. I've been managing horses since I was 12. The cold doesn't bother me." She said it without heat, just information. Hargrove looked at her the way men look at women who have spoken when they weren't expecting to need to account for them. "I'm sure you're managing fine," he said, in the slightly too warm tone of someone performing graciousness. "I am," she said. "And my husband's answer is no. So if you've come all this way for just the one question, it's been a long ride for a short answer." Something moved behind Hargrove's eyes. Not anger, not yet. Assessment. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the paddocks and the barn when he rode in, pricing things, figuring out what he was actually dealing with. He left graciously. He was very good at leaving graciously. He shook Rowan's hand again, said something pleasant and general about hoping they'd have good weather for the rest of the season, walked back to his horse and remounted and rode out with his 2 men behind him. And all of it was so smooth and practiced that it took Beatrice a moment to identify what felt wrong about it. He hadn't looked surprised when the answer was no. He'd looked like a man noting down a piece of information he was going to use later. "He came to get a look at the operation," she said, when the sound of hooves faded. "Yes," Rowan said. "And at me." "Probably." "He knows more than he pretended to be starting from," she said. "The way he came in, he'd already decided how he was going to handle meeting me. That takes preparation." Rowan looked at her. "Gerald," he said. "Most likely," she said. "The question is what he thinks he learned today." Rowan was quiet for a moment. He was doing the thing she'd noticed where he worked through a problem internally before speaking, laying it out in order. "He thinks I've taken on a wife who's a financial burden," he said slowly. "He thinks I'm overextended. He's probably been told that you bring nothing material to the arrangement." Gerald would have told him that, yes, she said. She said it without particular bitterness. It was just accurate. What does he do with that information? He waits, Rowan said, and he applies pressure somewhere else. The land survey thing last spring, that took him 6 months to set up and 3 months to play out. He's patient. She thought about that. Patient men who were also wealthy men, and also men who had decided they wanted something and hadn't gotten it yet. Those were a particular kind of problem. They didn't attack directly because they didn't need to. They created conditions. We need to know what condition he creates, she said, before it becomes a problem rather than a developing situation. I know someone in the county seat who'll hear things, Rowan said. I'll write him. She nodded. Then she went back to check the fence posts she'd been fixing before Hargrove arrived, because the posts weren't going to fix themselves, and Hargrove wasn't going to be solved before lunch, regardless of how much she thought about him. December came in behind a week of clear cold, the kind that was beautiful to look at and serious to work in, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythm. The days were short and full. She learned the mountain's winter version of itself. The way the light came low and sideways across the snow by 10 in the morning, and the way the temperature could drop 15 degrees in an hour when the clouds came off the peaks, and the particular silence of very cold days when even the trees stopped moving. Duchess's pregnancy was progressing cleanly. Beatrice checked her daily and was satisfied with what she saw, but she kept watching because first-season mountain mares sometimes threw surprises in the second trimester, and she wanted to catch anything early. Garnet had arrived at a settled working relationship with her, which she understood was significant without making too much of it. He still argued about things that he considered optional, which was most things. But when she told him something was not optional, he read that too and complied with only minimal commentary. Rowan watched this dynamic with an expression she'd started to identify as something between impressed and vaguely betrayed. He's been doing the 3 degrees off thing to me for 4 years, Rowan said one evening. They were at the kitchen table going through the winter feed calculations. You've been here 4 months and he's stopped. He hasn't stopped, she said. He's just doing it with more subtlety, so I have to pay more attention to catch it. Rowan considered that. That's worse, isn't it? For the horse? No, he's actually trying. For you. She looked up. He always tried with me. He just decided it was worth the effort. She meant it as horse analysis, but she felt Rowan hear it as something else also, and she didn't correct him. The letter from the county contact came in the second week of December, delivered by a rider who came through on the valley to mountain post route. Rowan read it at the table and then passed it to her without comment. The contact wrote that Ellison Hargrove had recently taken a meeting with the county land commissioner, subject of the meeting unspecified, but following on a request for updated survey data for the northern range parcels. He had also made inquiries, through a lawyer in the capital, regarding the legal requirements for adverse possession claims on mountain grazing land that had been used inconsistently. Beatrice read that last part twice. He's building a case that you don't maintain consistent use, she said. He's going to try to claim part of the grazing land. That's what it looks like. Can he? If he can prove inconsistent use over a sufficient period and file before I contest it, there's legal argument for it. Rowan's voice was steady, but she could hear something underneath it that she recognized as anger being kept at a distance through deliberate effort. The northern grazing is where I run the herd in summer. It's the best high pasture on this range. Do you have records of consistent use? I keep logs, he said, but they're my own logs. It's my word against whatever a county surveyor with a reason to find differently might conclude. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, Show me the northern pasture when the weather allows, and show me your logs from the last 6 years. He looked at her. Why the last 6? Adverse possession timelines, she said. 6 years is usually the threshold they try to argue from. He was quiet for a moment. How do you know that? My father had a boundary dispute with a neighbor when I was 16, she said. I read every piece of paper the lawyer sent us. I wanted to understand what was happening. She paused. We won, eventually. It took 2 years and cost money we didn't have. He got up and went to the shelf where he kept his ranch records. Not the breeding logbooks, which lived in the barn, but the operational records, the daily logs that noted what happened and when, which horses went where, what repairs were made, what the weather did. They were thorough. more thorough than she'd expected. "You've been keeping these for how long?" she said. "Since I arrived," he said. "First winter taught me that if you don't write it down, you lose the pattern." She looked through the northern pasture entries. Horses moved there reliably each May and stayed through September, rotating sections with the kind of deliberate land management that didn't happen by accident. It was consistent and documented, and it went back 11 years. "This is good," she said. "It should be enough," he said. "But a man with money and a cooperative surveyor can complicate enough." "Yes," she said. "He can." She set the log down. "We need to ride the northern boundary when the snow clears and document the current line with fresh markers. Something physical and dated. It doesn't hurt your case to have it." "That'll be a week's work," he said. "2 of us, maybe 4 days." "Then we do it in 4 days," she said. He looked at her across the table and she understood, from his expression, that he was doing the thing again, registering what she was, cataloging it, adding it to whatever understanding he was building of the person he'd married. She was getting more comfortable being seen by him. Not because it was comfortable exactly, but because she'd begun to trust that what he saw was what was there, and that what was there was what he wanted. That understanding, partial and still forming, was not the same as love. She knew the difference. But it was something solid, something you could build on. And on a mountain where everything tried to tear things down, solid was worth more than beautiful. The real winter arrived in January. She'd been told about frostback winters. She'd thought she understood. She had not understood. The first week of January brought a storm that made the November forerunner look like a clearing of the throat before the actual speech. 3 days in, the snow was at window level on the north side of the house. The temperature had dropped to the kind of number that made ordinary equipment fail in ways you didn't anticipate. Hinges seized, water froze in pipes. She hadn't known were vulnerable. The barn door on the east end stuck hard and required both of them working at it to free it, and they'd had to break off one of the hinges completely to get it open at all. The horses were managed, but it was work. 4 times a day she and Rowan were in the barn, checking water troughs, clearing snow from the run-in roof before the weight compromised the structure, watching the animals for signs of cold stress or injury, or the early signs of respiratory trouble that came when this cold got into lungs not fully accustomed to it. Beatrice slept 4 hours the second night and 3 hours the third. She was tired in a bone-level way that she recognized from difficult stretches of ranch work, the kind of tired that becomes its own altered state, where you stop feeling it and just move from task to task with the deliberate focus of someone who knows that stopping is worse. On the 4th night, the wolves came. She heard them before she saw any sign, not howling, which was what people who'd never been close to wolves expected, but the particular quiet that descended on the horses in the barn when something outside had their complete attention. She was awake immediately, feet on the floor before she'd consciously registered what had changed, pulling her coat on in the dark. Rowan was already up. She heard him moving in the kitchen, heard the particular sound of him going for the rifle, and she went to the front room and said, "How many?" He was at the window. "Can't see. 7, 8. They're at the far paddock." She thought of the 3 young horses they'd moved into the outer paddock 2 days ago because the barn was at capacity and the 3 of them were hardy enough and had shelter. The wolves were not at the barn. "I need the shotgun," she said. "Beatrice, I'm bigger than you," she said. "In waist-deep snow I can keep moving. Give me the shotgun." He looked at her for a moment, not doubting her, she understood, but assessing the same way she assessed, working through the actual calculation rather than the reflexive argument. Then he handed her the shotgun and took the rifle himself, and they went out the back door into the cold that hit like a wall. She had been cold before. She had not been this cold before. The air was something beyond cold, something that had a physical weight to it, pressing on her face and hands and any exposed skin with an intensity that was almost aggressive. She dropped her head and moved. The snow between the barn and the outer paddock was thigh-deep in the drifts and knee-deep in the more open ground, and she found out very quickly that the people who said her size was a disadvantage had never tried to move through serious snow conditions. Her weight pushed through instead of on top, which meant she was working hard, but she wasn't being thrown off balance by the uneven crust. She kept moving. Rowan was behind her, and she could hear him working harder, lighter, less contact with the ground, the snow's crust catching him differently. The wolves were visible at the paddock fence when she got there. She counted 6 in the first sweep, dark shapes moving against the white, and the three horses in the paddock were bunched at the far corner from the wolves, doing exactly what horses should do, staying together and making themselves a consolidated target rather than scattering, which told her the horses had some experience with predators or were smart enough to figure it out. Either way, it was buying time. One wolf was testing the fence, not pushing through it, just testing, finding the give. Beatrice raised the shotgun and fired once into the air. The sound in the cold was enormous and flat, a sound that had no softness to it, and every wolf stopped moving for a full second. Then two of them bolted. The remaining four regrouped. She could see them doing it, the pack intelligence working, pulling together rather than scattering. The lead animal turned toward her. She held very still and did not look directly at the animal, which was the instinct you had to overcome, the hardest thing about predator encounters. Looking directly said challenge, and challenge said escalate. She looked at the space between the lead wolf and the fence and held the shotgun at a ready angle, visible, and waited. From her left, Rowan's rifle fired once, not at the lead wolf, but past it, into the snow beyond, sound and impact. The lead wolf flinched, looked toward that direction, and made the calculation that the pack made almost simultaneously. They went. Not running in full panic, wolves didn't break the way prey did, but moving with a deliberate shift in direction that said this location had become more trouble than the value. She stood at the paddock fence until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she shook. Not dramatically, just a fine tremor in her hands that she couldn't entirely control, which she recognized as the body's delayed processing of adrenaline, and she gripped the fence rail until it passed. Rowan came up beside her. He was breathing hard from the snow work. "Horses are okay," she said. Her voice was steady. She was annoyed at her hands. "Yes," he said. He was looking at her. "You're shaking." "I know. It'll pass." She let go of the fence rail. "I need to check each of them physically. Cold stress. Any minor injuries from moving against the fence in panic." "In a minute," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "I'd rather move than stand here." "Beatrice." He put his hand on her shoulder. She stopped. "You just walked into 6 wolves," he said. "In the dark. In the worst cold this mountain has seen in 10 years. He was close enough that she could see his breath and feel the cold coming off his coat. "Give yourself 1 minute." She gave herself 1 minute. She stood there in the deep cold with his hand on her shoulder and listened to the horses beginning to move again in the paddock as their fear settled, and felt the shaking in her hands slow and stop. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said, and they went to check the horses. All 3 were unhurt. The fence had held. She ran her hands over each animal in the dark, working by touch, and the pale light that the snow itself threw up, and found nothing worse than elevated pulse and the particular muscle tension of animals that had been frightened and hadn't finished processing it yet. She stood with each horse for a few minutes, just her weight and warmth and steadiness as information, and felt them settle one by one. They got back to the house at 2 in the morning. She was wet to the knee from snow, and her hands were clumsy with cold, and the kitchen was warm and lit and felt. In that moment, like the most real place she had ever been. Rowan put water on for coffee. She sat at the table and worked her coat off and looked at her hands, chapped and red from the cold, still slightly unsteady in a way she didn't think he could see from where he was standing. "You knew to fire into the air first," he said, "not at the lead animal. Kill the leader and the pack stays longer to sort out the hierarchy," she said. "Drive them off, and they'll find easier ground." She paused. "My father told me that. Told me, never expected to use it." He set a cup in front of her. He didn't say anything for a moment, and she looked up, and his expression was the one she hadn't quite learned to read yet. The one that appeared at the moments when she'd done something that surprised him. Not because he'd thought her incapable, but because she'd exceeded the specific version of capable he'd been imagining. "You know what I was thinking," he said, "when you said, 'Give me the shotgun.' You were thinking it was dangerous and you were the man, so you should go," she said. "Yes." He sat down. "And then I did the actual calculation." "And?" "And you were right. In that snow, your weight is an advantage. I'd have been slower and less stable and probably not gotten there in time." He wrapped his hands around his own cup. "I don't enjoy admitting that I thought wrong before I thought right." "Most people don't," she said. "The ones who do it anyway are the useful ones." He looked at her steadily. Is that how you decided to marry me? I seemed like the useful type. There was something different in the way he said it. Not a casual question, an actual one. She thought about what to say. She thought about the afternoon in the paddock and the way he'd read the logbook and the way he'd looked at her with no particular emotion attached, just the actual calculation of what he was looking at. You seemed like someone who thought past the first thing they saw, she said carefully. That's rarer than it sounds. What did you see when you looked at me? A man who knew how to read a breeding log, she said, and who'd built a barn that understood snow load, she paused, and who wasn't going to stand in my doorway and tell me I was wrong for leaving. He was quiet. That last one mattered a great deal, she said. Outside the storm had shifted again, a new angle of wind finding the north wall. She sat across from Rowan Voss and drank her coffee and thought about the wolves moving through the dark beyond the paddock fence, finding their easier ground, and about the horses settling in the paddock, and about the two of them in this kitchen in the middle of a January night, and how the things that were becoming real between them were being built out of exactly the materials the mountain provided, cold and difficulty, and the particular necessity of being honest about what you could and couldn't do. She had not said she was falling in love with him. She wasn't ready to say something that large with any certainty. But when he'd put his hand on her shoulder in the snow and said, "Give yourself 1 minute," she hadn't pulled away. She'd stood there and let herself be steadied by another person, which was something she hadn't done in longer than she could clearly remember. That was not nothing. She was thinking about this, staring at her cup, when Rowan said quietly, "I should tell you something." She looked up. "The offer I made you in Pine Crossing," he said. "I told you I needed someone to manage the ranch. That was true. I told you I wasn't looking for decoration." He paused. "That was also true, but it wasn't the whole of it." "What was the rest?" "I'd been up here alone for 7 years," he said. "I'd convinced myself that was fine, that I preferred it." He looked at his coffee. "Then I rode into Pine Crossing and I watched you calm that bay colt in the paddock for 40 minutes without touching him, and you were the most settled person I had seen in a long time. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you weren't asking anyone to watch you do it." She said nothing. "I thought about it for 2 days before I asked you," he said. "It was an impulse. I want you to know that." The storm said something against the north wall, a long, low pressure that she was learning to read as the wind shifting toward dawn. "I thought about it for 1 night," she said, "before I said yes." She looked at him. It wasn't impulse either. He met her eyes. There was no dramatic moment, no music in it, nothing that would have satisfied anyone who wanted a clean story. Just two people at a kitchen table in the middle of a mountain winter, both of them imperfect and tired, and telling each other something that had been building for months in the spaces between all the practical things. It was enough. More than enough. She went to bed just before 3 and slept the remaining dark hours without dreaming, and woke to Rowan already in the barn, and dressed and went out to help him. And the day began the same as all the days did. With the horses, with the work, with the cold pressing in from every direction, and the two of them moving through it with the practiced and still developing coordination of people who had decided they were going to figure out how to do this together. 3 days later, Duchess went into her delivery 4 weeks early. Beatrice was in the barn when it started doing the afternoon check, and she felt the change in the mare before she saw it. Duchess moving differently in her stall, the specific restlessness of an animal whose body had begun a process without consulting the schedule. She checked the position and her stomach dropped. The foal was breech. She called for Rowan, not loudly because loud would escalate the mare's anxiety, but with enough edge in her voice that he appeared in the barn doorway within 2 minutes. "She's early and the foal's wrong," Beatrice said. "I need your hands to help hold her steady, but I need you to do exactly what I tell you and nothing else." He looked at Duchess and then at Beatrice and said, "Tell me." She worked for an hour and 40 minutes. There were moments in that hour and 40 minutes that were extremely bad. There was a point around the 40-minute mark where she thought she had the foal's positioning correct and then lost it and had to restart, and she heard the sound she made. Not a word, just a sound, and felt Rowan's hand briefly on her back, not holding her, just there, just present, and then gone when she needed both hands again. She did not think about anything except what was in front of her. She did not think about Hargrove or the northern boundary or the wolves or the cold. She thought about the specific physical problem in front of her, about what her hands were feeling and what she needed to do with the information they were giving her, about Duchess who was tired and frightened and needed this to be over. The foal came at the end of the hour and 40 minutes, a small dark filly who was slow to breathe and then breathed, and Beatrice sat back on her heels in the straw and shook again, the same fine tremor as after the wolves, and this time she didn't try to stop it or move past it immediately. She just let it happen. Rowan was beside her. He had straw in his hair from the low ceiling. "They're both okay?" he said. "Both okay," she said. He let out a breath. She heard the length of what he'd been holding in it. They sat in the straw for a few minutes while Duchess attended to her filly with the focused and slightly anxious thoroughness of a first-time mother. And outside the January cold pressed against the barn walls. And in the corner, Garnet made a low sound in his stall, curious, attending, part of whatever was happening in his barn. And Beatrice thought about her father's voice when she was 12 years old, standing in the cold outside a difficult delivery, telling her, "You can't always save them, but you have to try everything you know before you decide you can't." She'd tried everything she knew. This time it had been enough. She leaned her head back against the stall wall and closed her eyes for a moment and felt the exhaustion of the last weeks. The cold, the wolves, the Hargrove visit, the land survey letter, all of it, sitting on her like physical weight, and underneath it, deeper and more durable, something that had been growing since she rode up this mountain 4 months ago and hadn't entirely known what to call. She thought she was beginning to know what to call it. The filly Duchess had delivered in January was named Clara, which was Beatrice's mother's name, and Rowan had suggested it one morning about a week after the birth. Without much ceremony, just said it while he was filling water troughs, and she'd looked at him, and he'd looked at his work, and neither of them had made a thing of it. She named the filly Clara. The winter continued doing what frostback winters did, which was everything it could to make life inconvenient. February brought 2 more storms, neither as severe as January's worst, but both serious enough to require the full attention of everyone on the ranch, which in this case was 2 people and no hired hands, because Rowan had not kept winter help in previous years, and they had not yet worked out whether to hire any this season before the worst of it arrived. That was a decision that had gotten away from them in the business of everything else. She didn't complain about it, neither did he. They divided the work with the wordless efficiency they'd been building since October, each of them knowing by now where the other was going to be and what they were going to need, and the things that had been awkward in the first weeks, the negotiation of shared space and shared tasks, had worn smooth in the way that wood wears smooth when hands work it long enough. What had also been happening, slower and less easy to document than feed schedules and fence repairs, was the thing between them. It hadn't arrived with any announcement. It had accumulated. It was in the way he handed her the coffee without being asked in the mornings now, knowing she needed it before she needed conversation. It was in the way she'd started reading the wind off the North Peaks and telling him what she thought it meant before he checked himself, and the way he'd started trusting her read. It was in the way he'd come into the barn one evening and found her sitting in the straw talking quietly to Clara about nothing in particular, and he'd stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything, and then come in and sat down nearby, and they'd stayed there a while in the companionable way of people who have stopped needing to fill silence to prove they're comfortable. It was love. She was clear-eyed enough to call it what it was by February. It was imperfect and still finding its shape, and not at all like anything she'd read about in the periodicals Gerald's wife had kept on the shelf in the front room. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like the stall swap she'd suggested on the first night. A practical adjustment that solved a real problem and made everything work better, and you knew it was right because the horses settled. She had not said it to him yet. He hadn't said it to her. They were both, she thought, people who moved carefully with the things that mattered most. The Hargrove problem came back to the surface in March, as the snow began retreating from the south-facing slopes, and the possibility of actual movement through the range returned. A second letter came from Rowan's contact in the county seat. This one was more specific. Hargrove had filed a formal inquiry with the Land Commission regarding the boundaries of 3 northern parcels in the Frostback Range, citing questions about continuous use and maintenance documentation. The inquiry was not yet a claim. It was a request for investigation, which was a legal step before an actual claim, a way of getting the machinery moving without having to prove anything yet. Rowan read it at the breakfast table and passed it to her and drank his coffee with the focused stillness of a man deciding how angry to let himself be. She read it carefully. Then she read it again. "He's timed it for early spring," she said, "before we can ride the boundary and document anything. He wants the inquiry moving before we've had a chance to respond to it." "Yes." "How quickly can we get up there?" "South face is clear enough now," he said. "North faces are still deep. A week, maybe less, if the temperature holds." "Then we go in a week," she said. "And we take the logbooks and we document every marker on that boundary and we file a counter-response to the inquiry before his investigation has anything to work with." "Lawyer in the Capitol. Write him today," she said. "He needs to know the timeline before we do." She watched Rowan's jaw work through something. He was a man who handled most things by handling them directly, and there was a particular frustration in dealing with an opponent who worked through bureaucratic channels and legal machinery rather than showing up and saying what he wanted plainly. "He's going to keep doing this," Rowan said. "Even if we beat this inquiry, he'll find another approach." "Yes," she said. "Probably. So we beat this one and prepare for the next one, and he keeps having resources to try again, and we keep spending what we have defending instead of building. That's how it works when someone with more money decides to want what you have," she said. "It's not fair, it's just true." He looked at her. "That doesn't bother you?" "Of course it bothers me," she said. "But being bothered doesn't change the situation. What changes the situation is making ourselves too expensive to attack." She thought about it. "We need the boundary documented. We need the logbooks verified by someone other than us, a notary or the county clerk, someone who can attest their genuine and continuous records. And we need to start building relationships with the other mountain ranchers, because Hargrove's land methods will concern them too if they think about it. And a coalition of ranchers with a legal grievance is harder to dismiss than one." Rowan was quiet for a long moment, looking at her. "What?" she said. "I've been up here alone for a long time," he said. "I managed things alone. I dealt with Hargrove alone, and not particularly well because I kept responding to each thing individually and not seeing the pattern." "You saw the pattern," she said. "You just didn't have anyone to work through it with." "That's what I mean," he said. She understood. She let it sit there rather than deflecting it, which was what she would have done 4 months ago. Minimized it, made it smaller, made herself smaller. She was working on that. "Write the lawyer," she said. "I'll pull the northern boundary logs and start organizing them." The week before they rode the boundary, something happened that she hadn't expected. Gerald arrived. She came out of the barn at mid-morning to find a horse tied at the rail that she recognized. The roan gelding Gerald used for distance travel. A decent animal she'd spent 6 weeks training 3 years earlier. Gerald was standing in the yard looking at the homestead with the expression of a man who had come prepared for several possible conversations and wasn't sure yet which one he was going to have. He looked older. That was the first thing. He'd aged in the months since she'd left Pine Crossing, or maybe she was seeing him differently from outside the daily proximity that had made him simply part of the landscape for so long. "B," he said. "Gerald," she said. He glanced at the barn. "Your husband about?" "He's on the north fence. He'll be back by noon." She was aware that she was not inviting him inside and that he was aware of it. "What brings you up?" He looked uncomfortable. Gerald had a way of being uncomfortable that still managed to look like he was doing you a favor by being there. It was a talent she'd never quite figured out, this ability to be in the wrong and maintain the air of someone conferring presence rather than requesting something. "Heard you had a rough winter," he said. "Who told you that?" "Talk gets around." He looked at the paddocks. "Wolves?" "In January. We managed." He nodded slowly. He was working around to something and she let him work. She'd spent 26 years watching Gerald approach things sideways, and she had no investment in making it easier for him. "I've had some trouble," he said finally. "What kind?" "Horse trouble. The training. After you left, I brought in a man from over in Coulter to handle the training work. He wasn't you." Gerald said that last part with the difficulty of a man physically moving an object that doesn't want to move. "Lost 2 contracts in the fall. The word's gotten out that the horses coming off the Holloway place aren't what they used to be." She was quiet. "I had to let the Daly brothers go," he said. "Couldn't cover their wages." She thought about Pete, with his hat in his hands and the $7. She felt something twist in her chest on his behalf, separate from anything she felt about Gerald. "I'm sorry to hear about Pete and Clem," she said. "They were good men." Gerald looked at her. "Is that all you've got to say about it?" "What would you like me to say, Gerald?" "I'm telling you the ranch is in trouble," he said, and there was something raw in it now, under the habitual performance. "I'm asking if you, I don't know, if there's something you can do." She looked at her brother. She looked at the man who had taken the rancher's coins without looking at her, and had stood in her doorway the night she packed and tried to make her feel small enough to stay, and who had, in all probability, told Ellison Hargrove whatever Hargrove had wanted to know about her in exchange for something. She didn't know what, but she understood Hargrove well enough by now to know he didn't have conversations that didn't cost the other party. "Did Hargrove come to see you?" she said. Something moved on Gerald's face. "He came by, introduced himself. We had a conversation." "What kind of conversation?" "He asked about you, about the work you'd done, about Rowan's operation." Gerald's eyes went to the ground. "He was friendly about it. He bought me a drink." "And you told him whatever he wanted to know," she said. Gerald didn't answer, which was its own answer. "What did he give you for it?" she said. "Nothing," Gerald said, too quickly. "He just asked questions. I answered them. I didn't know he was going to—" "He filed a land inquiry against this ranch, Gerald," she said, "based on information about our operation and our records. Information he'd have had to get from somewhere." She looked at him steadily. "You handed him ammunition against your own sister's home." Gerald's face had gone through red and was coming back to something worse, the gray-white of a man confronting something he'd managed not to look at directly. "I didn't know that's what he was going to do with it." "What did you think a man like Hargrove wanted information about his competitor's operation for?" she said. "You're not stupid, Gerald. Don't pretend you didn't suspect." He didn't say anything. She stood there for a moment and looked at her brother and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been angry at the same person for a long time and has run out of steam for the anger without running out of recognition of the original injury. She was not going to scream at him. She had never screamed at Gerald. It wasn't a decision she'd made once. It was just not something her anger did. "I can't come back to Pine Crossing," she said. "I wouldn't come back if I could. That's not what I want, and it's not what this ranch needs." "I'm not asking you to come back," he said, though she thought maybe he had been, before he'd actually said it. I don't know what I'm asking." "Go home," she said. "Hire someone who can train horses. There are 2 young men over in the Pratt Valley who've got decent hands, Fenner's son and the boy who works for the lumber operation. They're not me, but they can be trained if someone takes the time." She paused. "Don't talk to Hargrove again." I mean it, Gerald. Don't talk to him. Don't take his drinks. Don't tell him anything about this place." She met her brother's eyes. "He's not your friend. He doesn't have those." Gerald looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face she didn't often see, the stripped-back version of him, underneath all the performance, where there was just a man who'd made a series of choices that had led somewhere he hadn't intended, standing in front of the person he'd spent years diminishing because it was easier than examining himself. "You're doing well up here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "He treats you right, Voss?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and because saying true things was something she'd been practicing, "He's a good man." Gerald nodded. He went to untie his horse. "The Pratt Valley men," he said, not turning around. "You'd put in a word? If I approach them?" "I'll write a letter," she said. "Leave it at the county post in 3 weeks. You can collect it." He mounted up without looking at her again, which was its own complicated kind of thank you, and rode back down the mountain. Rowan came back from the north fence at noon and found her in the kitchen writing the letter for Gerald and the letters they needed for the lawyer and the county clerk, working through the stack with the organized focus she brought to paperwork. "Whose horse was that on the trail?" he said. "Gerald's." He said nothing for a moment, going to the stove. Then, "How'd that go?" "He talked to Hargrove," she said. "Gave him what he wanted to know about us." Rowan set down the pot he was holding. "I believe he didn't know what Hargrove would do with it," she said. "That doesn't fix it, but I think it's true." "Beatrice, he's my brother," she said. "He's limited. He's always been limited." She kept writing. I told him not to speak to Hargrove again, and I'm writing a letter to help him find decent trainers for the ranch. That's the extent of what I can do and the extent of what I'm willing to do." She paused. "Is that all right with you?" "You don't need my permission to deal with your family," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm asking if it's all right." He came to the table and sat down across from her. He looked at the stack of letters and the open logbook she'd been indexing, and her handwriting moving across the page in the efficient way she'd developed over years of keeping records that actually needed to be used rather than just kept. "It's all right," he said. She nodded and kept writing. They rode the northern boundary the following week, 3 days on the mountain with the late winter cold still in the ground and the snow retreating from the high places in patches, revealing the grass underneath in stages like something slowly coming back to life. She documented every marker post, every natural landmark, every seasonal water feature, in the precise and referenced way she'd learned from her father's boundary dispute, not just noting they were there, but noting their condition, their position, relative to fixed geological features, the date and weather, and her name as witness. Rowan rode ahead on sections he knew better and waited for her on the difficult approaches, not helping unless she asked for it. She asked twice, once on an icy traverse where an extra hand on the lead rope was genuinely useful, and once on a section of the boundary that she thought the original survey marker might have been moved, because the distances didn't match what was in the old records. That second thing was important. "This post," she said, standing beside a weathered cedar post that was supposed to mark the northeast corner of the northern parcel. "The distance from the outcrop there is 23 feet. Your 1921 survey record shows it at 17. Rowan looked at the post, then at the outcrop, then at the logbook. "The ground here doesn't shift that much from frost heave," he said slowly. "No," she said. "It doesn't." Someone moved the post. "Someone moved the post," she agreed, 6 feet inward from where it should be, which shrinks your legal boundary on this corner by whatever acreage that adjustment calculates to. She looked at the post and the ground around its base, which had been disturbed not so recently that it was obvious, but recently enough that the soil around the base was slightly different in color from the surrounding material. This was done in the fall, after the ground froze enough to disguise the work, but before the heavy snow covered it. Rowan's voice was quiet and level in a way she'd learned to read as controlled fury. "He sent someone up here." "Has to be," she said. "It's precisely 6 feet. That's not an accident, and it's not frost heave, and it's not a mistake by a tired rancher. Someone measured this and moved it." They documented everything: measurements, soil disturbance, photographs described in writing since they had no camera, witness statements they wrote out for each other on the spot with their signatures, dating the document on the mountain with the specific day and weather conditions as corroboration. She reset the post in its correct position. She found the original anchor stone still in the ground 6 feet to the southeast, which was further confirmation that the post had been moved rather than placed wrong originally. She set it true and tamped the ground around it with her boot heel and stood back and looked at it. "This is what he needed the inquiry for," she said. "Not to win it, to give himself time to manufacture evidence that we've been maintaining wrong boundaries. An inquiry stalls everything. Then his surveyor comes up here and finds a post in the wrong position and files a report, and suddenly it looks like our records don't match our physical markers." "Except our records do match," Rowan said, "because the post was in the right position when the records were made." "Except we have to prove that," she said, "which we can now do because I found the original anchor and the soil disturbance. If we'd come up here 2 weeks later, after more rain and wind, that evidence would be a lot harder to establish." Rowan looked at her. "You knew to look for exactly that." "My father's dispute," she said. "His neighbor moved a stone marker about 8 inches. Enough to matter legally, not enough to be obvious unless you looked for it." She brushed the dirt from her hands. "People who try to take things through legal machinery usually don't invent the claim from nothing. They arrange the physical evidence to match the legal argument they're going to make. You have to catch them between when they arrange it and when they present it." "How did you know he'd arranged something rather than just filing a bad faith inquiry?" "Because the inquiry was filed in early spring before we could ride up here," she said. "If he was just making a legal argument, he could file at any time. The timing tells you he needed the inquiry to create a window. A window for what? That's what you come up here to find out." Rowan stood in the cold mountain air looking at the correctly positioned post and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I spent 2 years dealing with him through lawyers and formal responses and careful documentation. I never came up here looking for what he'd actually done. You were alone, she said. You were managing everything. Yes, he said. But that's not the whole reason. She waited. I thought the legal record would be enough, he said. I thought if I kept the right records and told the truth would handle itself. He looked at her. You don't think that? I think the truth needs help, she said. It needs to be documented at the right time and witnessed and filed in the right place and attached to physical evidence and presented to someone with the authority to act on it. The truth by itself is just something you know. It doesn't do anything until someone does something with it. He was quiet again. She picked up the logbook and started back toward the horses. Beatrice, he said. She turned. I'm glad you're here, he said. And he said it simply, without dress, the way he said the things that mattered to him. As information, plain and specific, with no performance around it. She held it for a moment. I know, she said. I am too. They came back down the mountain with the documentation, and the lawyer's letter went out the following day, and 6 days after that a writer came up from the valley with a response from the county clerk's office acknowledging receipt of their counterfiling and noting that the investigation had been put on hold pending review of the evidence submitted. It was not a victory. It was a temporary position. But it was a position. Spring came on fast after that, the way mountain springs came. Not gradually, but in a rush, the snow pulling back from the south faces first, and the grasses underneath springing up almost immediately, green and urgent. The horses went out onto the pastures with the focused enthusiasm of animals that had been inside too long, moving differently in the open, and Clara, now 4 months old and no longer the small, worried thing she'd been in January, ran circles around her mother with the particular reckless joy of a young horse discovering what her legs were for. Beatrice watched her from the fence and felt something uncomplicated. The first buyers came up in April. Word had gotten further than she'd realized, not just in the mountain communities, but down into the valley ranches, spread partly through the normal channels of horse trading and partly through something else she'd underestimated, which was the story that had gotten around about the breech delivery in January. She had not told that story. Rowan had not told it. But Preacher Marsh traveled his circuit and talked to people, and apparently at some point he'd been at a supper table where someone had mentioned the Voss horses, and Marsh had said something about what he'd heard from his last visit, and the version that traveled was a version she barely recognized when it came back to her. It had been cleaned up and dramatized in the telling, the way stories always are. But the core of it was there, that there was a woman in the Frostback Range who had saved a mare and foal in the worst January anyone could remember, alone in a blizzard, and that the Voss horses were the best conditioned animals coming off the mountain range that season. The first buyers were a pair of brothers from the lower valley who ran a freighting operation and needed reliable mountain horses. They came up with the prepared wariness of men who'd heard stories and didn't entirely trust them, ready to assess for themselves. She let them assess. She walked them through the barn, answered their questions directly, brought out the animals they asked about without commentary that might seem like selling. When one of the brothers questioned whether a particular gelding had the temperament for heavy freight work, she said plainly that he didn't, that he was better suited to lighter mountain work, and she'd recommend 2 other animals from the herd instead. The brother who'd asked the question looked at her for a moment. Most sellers don't tell you when one of their horses isn't what you're looking for, he said. Most sellers don't care whether you come back, she said. They bought 3 horses. They came back 6 weeks later and bought 2 more. The second group that came was harder. A rancher named Collard arrived in late April with Gerald Holloway and Ellison Hargrove's ranch manager, a man named Sutton, who everyone understood was there on Hargrove's behalf rather than his own. Collard had apparently made arrangements through Gerald, which explained Gerald's presence. Gerald had given Collard a reference to the Voss ranch, probably trying to make some form of repair through being useful, without understanding or caring that Hargrove's man was attached to the transaction. Beatrice saw the group coming up the trail from the upper paddock and stood very still for a moment. She walked down to meet them. Rowan came out of the barn as they pulled up in the yard. She saw him take in who was present, and she saw the exact moment he registered Sutton and understood what that meant. His expression didn't change. She'd learned to read the parts of his face that didn't change. Collard was a heavy-set man with the red-faced bluster of someone who considered his money a personality. He made a show of being friendly, shook Rowan's hand enthusiastically, barely glanced at Beatrice in that first exchange, which she noted without making anything of it. Sutton said nothing. He stood back and looked at the paddocks with Hargrove's assessment behind his eyes. Gerald looked uncomfortable. He looked at Beatrice with something that might have been an apology or might have been a request for her not to make this difficult, and she genuinely couldn't tell which. "Heard good things about your horses," Collard said. "Harvey here says you've got mountain stock coming off this range that's worth making the trip for." Harvey was Gerald. Gerald had apparently been providing references to buyers. She was going to have to think about what to do with that. "We have good horses," Rowan said. "What are you looking for?" Collard wanted 6 animals for a mountain grazing operation. He was expanding to the eastern range. Reliable, cold-hardy, capable of handling difficult terrain with loaded pack saddles. It was exactly what the Voss operation produced. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a significant sale. She walked him through the herd. She answered his questions. She brought out the 4 animals she thought best suited to his described use and explained her reasoning. Collard was nodding along, clearly satisfied. He looked at the 4 horses and said, "Good animals. Let's talk price." Then Sutton spoke. He said it quietly, the way Hargrove did things. Not dramatic, just positioned. He said, "I've heard you had a difficult delivery this winter. Lost a foal?" Beatrice looked at him. "We didn't lose the foal," she said. "She's in the south paddock." "I heard different," Sutton said. "Then you heard wrong," she said. "I can show you the animal if you'd like to see her." Sutton's expression didn't change. "I've also heard there are some questions about whether the northern grazing land this operation uses actually falls within your legal boundaries. Man buys horses from a ranch that might not be around next season." "The inquiry's been addressed," Rowan said. "The land is documented. The counterfiling is on record." "Inquiries can be reopened," Sutton said. Collard was looking between them now, the enthusiastic buyer expression shifting to the wariness of a man who'd wandered into something he hadn't anticipated. Beatrice said, "Mr. Collard." He looked at her. "You came up here for horses," she said. "I've shown you 4 animals that are exactly what you described needing. You've seen them move, you've seen their condition, you've heard their history." She paused. "This man works for Ellison Hargrove, who runs a competing operation and has a financial interest in you buying horses somewhere other than here. You can weigh that information however you like." Sutton's jaw tightened. "The land inquiry he's referencing has been countered with documentation that the county clerk's office has acknowledged and put on hold," she continued. "If you'd like to see that documentation, I can provide it." She looked at Collard steadily. "What I can't tell you is that this transaction is simple, because apparently it isn't. What I can tell you is that the horses are sound, the price is fair, and the decision is yours." Collard looked at the 4 horses. He looked at Sutton. He looked at Gerald, who was studying the ground with the focused attention of a man hoping to become temporarily invisible. "I'd like to see that documentation," Collard said finally. She brought it out. Collard looked through it with the careful attention of a man who'd been in land disputes himself and knew what he was reading. Sutton stood nearby with an expression that had moved from calculated to something less controlled. Collard bought the 4 horses. As the group was preparing to leave, with the horses loaded, Gerald came to where Beatrice was standing by the barn door. "I didn't know Sutton was coming," he said quietly. "Collard mentioned he was bringing a friend. I didn't know who." "I know," she said, because she did. Gerald wasn't strategic enough to have arranged it deliberately, and if he had, she thought she would have been able to tell. "You handled it well," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. The same stripped-back look he'd had on the mountain in March, the one where the performance was gone. "You're different up here." She thought about what to say. Then she said, "I'm the same. I just have somewhere to be it." Gerald looked at the mountains for a moment. Then he went to his horse. Sutton was the last to mount up. He looked at Beatrice across the yard with the level look of a man noting her as an obstacle rather than a person, cataloging her, deciding what to report to Hargrove. She looked back at him with exactly the same quality of attention. He rode out. Rowan came and stood beside her as the sound of the horses faded down the trail. "Hargrove's going to know the inquiry didn't work," he said. "Yes," she said. "He'll try something else." What do you think it'll be? She considered. He wanted the breeding rights to Garnet, she said. That was always the original goal. Everything else has been pressure to make you willing to negotiate. She watched the empty trail. I think the next thing will be more direct. He'll come himself. And when he does? She looked at Rowan. Then we'll have the conversation we've been building towards since November, she said. And we'll have our documentation and our records and our boundary markers and our counterfilings, and we'll have a sale to Collard that Sutton watched happen and can't explain away. And we'll be on our own ground. Rowan looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, with the particular attention of a man who kept finding the thing in front of him more than he'd expected. Our ground, he said. Our ground, she said. They went back to work. There was always more work, on a mountain ranch in the building season, and she had learned to be grateful for it, for the specific way that physical work held you in the present, in the body, in the actual texture of the day. No room for the spiraling anxiety of thinking too far ahead. No room for the retrospective grief of looking too far back. Just the task in front of you and the person working beside you and the horses moving in the afternoon light. Clara came to the fence where Beatrice was working the south paddock and stood there with her chin over the rail doing the thing she'd been doing since she was 3 weeks old, watching Beatrice work with the focused interest of an animal that had decided this particular human was the most interesting thing in the immediate environment. Not yet, Beatrice told her. Another 6 months before we start anything serious with you. Clara breathed on her shoulder. I know, she said. You're very patient. From across the paddock, she heard Rowan make a sound she'd learned over the winter to identify as the sound he made when he was about to say something that was going to matter. She looked up. He was looking at her from the gate. In the afternoon light, with the mountains behind him and the horses in the paddock between them, he had the look of a man who'd decided something. I love you, he said. Simple as the stall swap. Simple as handing her the shotgun in the dark. Simple as yes. She held it for a moment. I know, she said. He waited. I love you too, she said. I've been working up to saying it. I know, he said. They went back to work. The mountain kept doing what it did, which was everything it could to test you, and they kept doing what they did, which was answer it, and the horses ran in the late spring light, and it was not a perfect life and not an easy one, and not at all what the periodicals described when they talked about marriage and happiness. It was better than that. It was real. Hargrove came in June, as she'd predicted he would. He came alone this time, which she had not predicted, and that told her something immediately. No men waiting on their horses in the yard, no Sutton taking notes, just Hargrove himself on the flashy dun, riding up to the homestead on a warm morning when the high pastures were fully green and the horses were out in numbers, and everything about the Voss ranch looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, like exactly what it was becoming. She was in the round pen with a young gelding she'd been starting, 3 years old, good bone, the kind of patient, intelligent temperament that made you optimistic about a horse's future. When she heard the hoofbeats, she finished what she was doing with the gelding, asked him to stop, let him stand and breathe for a moment, then brought him in and handed him to the water trough before she went to see who had arrived. Rowan was already in the yard. She came around the corner of the barn and rid the scene in about 2 seconds. Hargrove dismounted, hat in hand, which was a different posture than November, and Rowan standing with his arms at his sides and his face doing the neutral thing. She kept walking. Hargrove saw her coming and watched her cross the yard with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the recalibrating look from November, not the smooth performance. Something more straightforward, which she decided to take as a sign that he'd run out of the particular patience that smoothness requires. Mrs. Voss, he said. Mr. Hargrove, she said. She stopped beside Rowan. I came to have a plain conversation, Hargrove said. If you're both willing. We're willing, Rowan said. Hargrove looked at the horses in the far pasture for a moment. She watched him doing it and understood for the first time with clarity what he actually felt when he looked at this operation. Not just competitive calculation, but something older and less rational than that. He wanted what was here. Not for practical reasons, or not only for practical reasons. There was something about the Voss horses, about the quality that came off this particular mountain with its particular demands, that Hargrove's money and his valley land and his showy breeding program had never managed to produce, and he knew it, and it had been eating at him for years before she ever arrived. The inquiry's been dropped, he said. My lawyer advised me it wasn't going to go anywhere, not with what you filed. I know, Rowan said. The boundary post, Hargrove said, and paused. Beatrice said nothing. She waited. Sutton acted without my specific instruction, Hargrove said. She looked at him steadily. He met her eyes and then looked away, which was the most honest thing she'd seen him do. I don't know if that's true, she said. I suspect it isn't, but it doesn't change what needs to happen next, so it doesn't matter much either way. Hargrove looked at her. What needs to happen next? You need to stop, she said. The inquiries, the surveys, the men riding past our fence line, the conversations with people in the valley designed to create doubt about this operation. All of it. She said it without heat, the way she said most things that she meant completely. You have a large ranch and a profitable operation and a market that's different from ours. There's no reason we need to be in conflict. Garnet, Hargrove said, is not for sale, Rowan said, and the breeding rights are not for sale. That's not going to change. You could name your price, Hargrove said, and she could hear the effort it cost him to say it that plainly. This man who operated through indirection, being forced by the failure of indirection to just say the thing. It's not about price, Beatrice said. Garnet is the foundation of a breeding program that produces animals suited to this specific mountain range. His offspring have characteristics that took years to develop and that we're still developing. Selling his breeding rights to your operation changes what those offspring become, because your program has different goals. We'd be selling the thing that makes us what we are. That's sentiment, Hargrove said. It's strategy, she said. Sentiment would be me telling you he's a good horse and I like him. Strategy is me telling you that the reason your buyers keep asking where they can get horses like ours is specifically because we haven't sold you access to Garnet. Hargrove was quiet. She could see him working through it, the businessman's mind doing the actual calculation, now that the legal approaches had failed. What would you sell? He said. Rowan glanced at her. She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it since the conversation with Rowan in April when she'd said Hargrove would come himself, and she'd kept thinking about it in the weeks since, turning it over the way she turned over horse problems, not from the angle of what she wanted, but from the angle of what actually solved the situation. Trained horses, she said, not breeding stock, not breeding rights. Finished animals, ready to work, with papers showing their lineage and training records showing what they can do. Your buyers who want mountain horses, we sell them the horses directly. You refer buyers to us. We give you a referral commission. Hargrove stared at her. You want me to send my buyers to you? I want us to stop spending time and money fighting over something that doesn't need to be a fight, she said. Your market is valley buyers who want attractive horses. Our market is working ranchers who need horses that can do a specific difficult job. Those markets overlap some and diverge a lot. We're not actually the same business. And you think I'd refer buyers to a competitor? I think you'd refer buyers to a supplier for a product you don't produce, she said, in exchange for a percentage, because that's income you're currently losing to us anyway, and at least this way you get something from it. She paused. And I think the alternative is that we keep building documentation of what Sutton did to that boundary marker, and eventually we take it somewhere that creates a problem for you considerably larger than a referral agreement. The yard was quiet. A horse in the far paddock called out, and one of the barn horses answered. Hargrove looked at Rowan. Your wife negotiates, he said. There was something in it that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite offense. Something in between, the reaction of a man who'd expected a certain kind of conversation and gotten a different one. Yes, Rowan said. She does. Hargrove looked back at Beatrice. He was doing the assessment she'd seen him do in November, but the version he was doing now was different. He wasn't pricing the operation or looking for leverage. He was looking at her, actually, as if he was seeing something he'd been looking around rather than at. 20% referral on each sale, he said. 15, she said. With a written agreement that defines what constitutes a referral. I'm not paying you 15% on a buyer who would have found us anyway. Hargrove almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but she could see it trying. 12.5, he said. And I want right of first refusal on any trained geldings you're selling in quantity. I have freight operators who need reliable mountain stock, and I'd rather have a standing supply arrangement than go horse by horse. She looked at Rowan. He gave her a small nod that meant he was following her lead. 12.5 with the freight arrangement, she said. The agreement comes from our lawyer. You review it with yours. Nothing is binding until both sign. Agreed, Hargrove said. They didn't shake hands. She noticed that. He went back to his horse and mounted up, and at the gate he turned back and said, "That breech delivery. In January." She waited. "I had a man try to match it last season," he said. "Lost the mare." She said nothing. "You've got something up here that I don't have," he said. Not graciously. It clearly cost him, but plainly. "I'd rather have a piece of it than keep fighting about it." He rode out. She stood in the yard for a long moment after the sound of his horse faded. The sun was fully up now, and the high pastures were catching it, the green running up toward the tree line in a way that she'd been watching for weeks and still wasn't tired of seeing. Clara was in the near paddock, nearly 5 months old now, and already showing the specific quality of mountain breeding, solid in the hindquarters, dense in the coat, with her mother's steadiness, and something else besides, something that was still forming. "You've been planning that since April," Rowan said. "Since March," she said. "When Gerald came up and told me about his referral arrangement with Collard, I thought, if Gerald could send buyers to us, why not Hargrove? He has better connections than Gerald, and more to gain from a clean arrangement than from a legal fight he'd already started losing." Rowan looked at the gate where Hargrove had gone. "You turned him from an enemy into a distribution channel." "I turned him into something that makes us both money," she said, "which is harder to dismantle than an enemy would be. Enemies can find new reasons to fight. A man making 12.5% on your sales has a reason to want you to succeed." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression she'd come to know best on him. Not the reserved neutrality he used as a default. Not the focused working expression, but the one underneath both of those, the one that was just him looking at her and not trying to look like anything else. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he said. She considered the question honestly. "Gerald," she said. He raised his eyebrows. "Gerald taught me that most conflict isn't about the stated problem," she said. "He'd fight with our father about chores, and it was never about the chores. He'd fight with buyers about price, and it was never about the price. Once you understand that, you stop trying to solve the stated problem, and you look for what the actual problem is." She paused. Hargrove's actual problem was that he wanted something he couldn't get, and it was making him behave badly. Give him something he can get and give him a reason to behave well. That solves the actual problem. "Your brother taught you that by being the problem," Rowan said. "The best teachers usually don't know they're teaching," she said. "Summer built itself slowly and then all at once, the way mountain summers did. You were still half in spring, and then one week everything was warm and the light was lasting until 9 in the evening, and the horses in the high pasture were running. Not because anything was chasing them, but because they felt good, and the ground was good, and there was room for it. She hired 2 hands in July. She'd been against it longer than she should have been, held back by the particular stubbornness of someone who'd been raised to believe that needing help was a kind of failure, and Rowan had been patient about it without pushing. And finally, she'd looked at the work volume and the expansion. The Hargrove arrangement was already generating and said simply, "We need help." "I know," Rowan said. "You could have said that 6 weeks ago." "I did say that 6 weeks ago," he said. "You said you wanted to think about it." She hired a young man named Aldous from the valley, who was 19 and knew horses reasonably well, and had the kind of consistent willingness to learn that was worth more at that age than natural talent. She also hired a woman named Ruth, who'd come up from the southern range settlements, recently widowed, who could outride most men Beatrice had seen and whose way with frightened horses reminded Beatrice uncomfortably and gratifyingly of herself. Ruth was small and quick and had very little patience for people who underestimated what she could do, which meant that she and Beatrice understood each other within about an hour of meeting. "You the one who did the breech delivery in January?" Ruth asked, on her first day, looking at the horses in the south paddock. "Yes," Beatrice said. "People are talking about that as far south as the Pratt Valley settlements," Ruth said. "I heard 3 different versions. In one of them, you fought off a wolf with your bare hands while you were doing it." "The wolf situation was separate," Beatrice said, "but there were wolves." "In January, yes. Not during the delivery." Ruth looked at her with the direct assessment of a woman who had been doing her own figuring out of what was real. "You're shorter than I expected," she said. "Everyone says that," Beatrice said, which wasn't true, but Ruth laughed anyway, and that was the beginning of that. The Hargrove agreement was signed in August. His lawyer had tried to adjust several terms, the way lawyers do, and their lawyer in the Capitol had countered each adjustment with the patient precision of someone who'd been given very specific instructions about what was acceptable. Beatrice had reviewed every draft herself, which had surprised Hargrove's lawyer enough that he'd made a comment about it to Rowan, apparently expecting Rowan to share the surprise. Rowan had said only that his wife had a thorough approach to paperwork, which was the most understated description of anything she'd ever heard him produce. The first referral sale under the agreement happened in September. A freight operator named Calloway, out of the Eastern Settlements, sent up by Hargrove's operation, who needed 4 reliable pack animals for mountain routes. Beatrice walked him through the geldings she had available, sold him 3 of the 4 she'd initially considered, and talked him out of the 4th because the 4th wasn't right for pack work in the specific terrain he described. And Calloway went home with 3 excellent animals, and came back in November with 2 colleagues who had their own needs. Hargrove received his 12.5%. She sent it promptly, the day after each sale closed, with a written accounting that showed exactly how the amount had been calculated. She'd decided, when she set up the arrangement, that the way you kept a man like Hargrove honest was to be more honest than he'd expected, and make it clear that you were tracking everything, so that the easier path was always to keep the agreement rather than test the edges of it. He sent a note with the 3rd payment acknowledgement. It said only, "The arrangement is working." She kept the note. Clara turned 1-year-old in December, which fell in the middle of the 2nd winter, and Beatrice came out to the paddock on the morning of that anniversary and stood at the fence and looked at the filly, no longer small, no longer uncertain on her legs, solid and curious, and already showing the quality that would make her remarkable in another year, and thought about the night of her birth, the hour and 40 minutes of work in the straw, the way the filly had been slow to breathe and then breathed. There were things you couldn't plan for. There were foals that came wrong, and conditions that turned in an hour, and men who moved boundary markers in the night, and brothers who didn't know what they were giving away when they talked to the wrong people. There were wolves and blizzards and January temperatures that broke equipment and tested the limits of what 2 people could hold together through sheer stubbornness. None of it had broken this place. She thought about that while Clara breathed warm air onto her coat and decided that Beatrice's collar was worth investigating. She thought about the woman who had stood in Gerald's barn 2 years ago, listening to the sound of coins going into her brother's pocket, feeling the particular hopelessness of a life that had arranged itself around her in shapes she hadn't chosen. She thought about the $22 under the loose board. She thought about the morning she'd ridden out of Pine Crossing without looking back, with a man she'd known for an afternoon, toward mountains she'd never been in. She had not known then what she was capable of. She'd had evidence of it, years of it, but evidence and knowledge are different things. Evidence is what other people can see. Knowledge is what you carry in your body as certainty, what you don't have to argue for because it's just true, the way your own hands are true. She knew now. It hadn't been the mountain that taught her that exactly. The mountain had provided the conditions, the cold that didn't care about your feelings, the wolves that didn't care about your history, the problems that presented themselves without any concern for whether you were ready. But the knowledge itself had come from doing the things, one after another, and finding each time that she was still standing on the other side of them. The world had told her, for a long time, that her body was a problem. Too large, too heavy, too much. And she had believed it, in the private interior way that you believe things you've heard repeated since childhood, even when another part of you is quietly maintaining a list of evidence to the contrary. The mountain had settled that argument permanently, not by being kind about it, but by being honest. The mountain didn't care what she looked like. The mountain had presented her with a horse about to go over a canyon edge, and wolves at the fence in the dark, and a breech delivery in January, and a man trying to take her land through legal machinery, and in each case the body that the town had called a burden had been exactly what the situation required. Not despite its size. Because of it. She was not going to pretend that the world had changed. She knew, because she still rode down to the valley sometimes and she still saw the looks, that the world had not changed. People still looked at her the way they looked at things that didn't fit their expectations, and some of them still had the particular cruelty of those who mistake their own discomfort for a moral position. What had changed was that their opinion occupied a smaller and smaller portion of the space she had available for other people's opinions. There was only so much room, and she had better things to put there. Rowan came out of the barn and crossed the yard to where she was standing at the fence. He stood beside her and looked at Clara the way he looked at all the horses they'd raised together, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has watched a thing develop from its most fragile moment to something that could stand on its own. "She's going to be better than Duchess," he said. "Don't tell Duchess that," Beatrice said. He mud the sound she'd identified over the past year as his laugh, which was not a big sound but was entirely genuine, which meant more to her than a performance. They stood at the fence in the December cold, and Clara lost interest in Beatrice's caller and moved off to investigate the water trough. And the mountains above the homestead were doing what they did in December, white and enormous, and completely indifferent, pressing down on everything below them. She had stopped finding the mountains indifferent, somewhere in the second year. Or rather, she had stopped minding the indifference. The mountain didn't love her. The mountain didn't hate her. The mountain simply was, and presented its conditions, and what you did with those conditions was entirely your own business. There was something she found deeply comfortable in that. "I had a letter from the county this week," Rowan said. She looked at him. "The land commissioner's office," he said. "The inquiry has been formally closed. No further investigation." She let out a breath. It wasn't surprise. She'd been expecting it since the Hargrove agreement went through, because a man who'd signed a business agreement had very little incentive to continue a legal fight that would destabilize the business he'd just signed on to. But knowing something is coming and having it arrive are different things, and the arrival of it, the final closure of the thing that had pressed on this place since before she'd come to it, felt like a door shutting cleanly. "Good," she said. "I thought you'd want to know," he said. "I'm glad it's done." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding something, the particular quality of his silence when he was moving toward saying something that mattered. "I've been thinking," he said, "about next spring." "What about it?" "The northern pasture. Now that the boundary is solid, we could run 10 more animals up there through summer. The grass is good, and we've been underusing it because of the uncertainty." He paused. "Which means we'd need another hand, maybe 2. "Ruth's been talking about her younger sister," Beatrice said. "She's got good hands, apparently." "We'd need to expand the barn," he said. "The east addition I've been putting off." "I know. I've got the materials listed. We can start in March if the weather cooperates." He looked at her. "You'd already planned for it." "I plan ahead," she said. "You planned for the expansion before the boundary was confirmed," he said. "You were certain it was going to resolve." "I was certain we'd done everything right and documented everything correctly, and that the law, given sufficient documentation and time, tends to work," she said. "That's not certainty about the outcome. That's confidence in the method." Rowan looked at the mountains. "I've been doing this for 11 years alone," he said. "I thought I was managing well." "You were," she said. "I was managing," he said. "That's different from what's happening now." He turned to look at her. "I want you to know I understand the difference." She looked at her husband, this man she'd married in a front room with a circuit preacher who told rambling stories, this man who had read her logbooks and looked at her without recalibration and said, "I'm not looking for decoration," and had meant every word of it. This man who had handed her the shotgun in the dark and put his hand on her shoulder in the snow and said, "Give yourself 1 minute," who had named the filly Clara without ceremony and said, "I love you," the same way he said everything that was true. Simple, specific, without performance. He was not a perfect man. He was sometimes too much in his own head, sometimes too slow to ask for help, sometimes stubborn about things that weren't worth the stubbornness. He had things from the 11 years before her that she didn't have the full shape of yet, and might not for a long time. I was a work in progress, the same as she was, the same as every person she'd ever respected was. "I know you understand the difference," she said. "That's one of the reasons I'm here." He put his arm around her, which he did sometimes, the uncomplicated physical fact of it, just presence. She leaned into it slightly, also uncomplicated. Clara had moved to the far end of the paddock and was engaged in some private investigation of the fence posts there, the way yearlings are always engaged in investigations of things that don't obviously need investigating. The second winter passed the way the first had, hard and demanding and full of the specific satisfaction of doing hard and demanding things in the company of someone who pulled in the same direction. There were no wolves in January that year, which she considered a reasonable trade for the fact that February brought a structural crack in the barn's east wall that required a week of cold weather repair work that was genuinely miserable. There were no dramatic deliveries, which was actually a disappointment in a small way because she'd spent the winter with Duchess and two other pregnant mares and had prepared carefully for complications that didn't materialize. All three mares delivered cleanly without anything asked of her beyond the standard attention. Aldous had turned out to be better than she'd hoped. He had a particular gift with the young horses, the ones in the starting stages, where his patience and his lack of ego, he didn't need to win, he just needed things to go right, made him effective in ways she recognized from her own early work. She gave him more responsibility than she'd planned to at his age, and he carried it carefully. Ruth was a different kind of valuable, not gentle, not particularly patient, but precise. She could assess an animal's condition in a walkthrough that would have taken Beatrice twice as long and reach the same conclusions. And her instinct for which horses needed what kind of work was the best natural instinct Beatrice had seen in another person. They disagreed sometimes, specifically about when to push a horse versus when to wait. And their disagreements were useful in the way that two people with good minds and different angles on the same problem are useful when they're both willing to follow the argument to the end. Beatrice had not had that before. She'd had people who worked for her, later or near her. She hadn't had a peer. She liked it more than she'd expected. The third spring arrived and the barn expansion went up in March and April, with Rowan and Aldous doing the heavy framing work, and Ruth and Beatrice handling the detailed carpentry that required more precision than brute strength, which meant Beatrice was doing some of both on any given day and didn't think twice about it. The East Addition was solid by May, which gave them the stall space they needed for the expanded herd, and Ruth's sister Vera arrived in June and turned out to be exactly what Ruth had described, which was a woman who sat a horse like she'd been born on one and had no patience for any approach to horsemanship that involved force where patience would do. The Frostback Ranch, by the summer of the third year, was not the same operation it had been when Beatrice arrived. The horses coming off the mountain were known well enough that buyers were making the trip without referrals, which meant the referral arrangement with Hargrove had become a smaller portion of their total business while still being reliable income that cost them nothing to maintain. The arrangement had changed Hargrove too, or at least changed how he dealt with them. The studied smoothness was still there, because it was built into him too deep to remove, but the active hostility had been replaced by something she'd call grudging respect if she were being generous, or pragmatic acceptance if she were being accurate. She was usually accurate. The things she had learned in 3 years on the mountain were not the things she'd expected to learn. She'd expected to learn the mountain itself, its weather patterns, its grazing conditions, its specific demands on horses and humans. She'd learned those, but the larger things had come sideways the way the important things usually do. She had learned that worth is not conferred. It is demonstrated, and then it is known, and once it is known, it cannot be unknown, no matter how inconvenient that knowledge is to the people who'd rather not know it. She had spent 26 years in Pine Crossing being overlooked by people who had decided in advance what she was, and she had demonstrated every single day exactly what she was, and they had looked past the demonstration because the demonstration contradicted what they'd decided. The mountain did not look past demonstrations. The mountain recorded them. The wolves knew she'd stood her ground. The horses knew what her hands felt like. The foals born healthy on this range carried the specific decisions she'd made in their lives. And Duchess's Clara running in the high pasture in her third year was the most visible evidence of a night's work that would still be on this mountain after Beatrice was gone. That was the thing that had settled something in her, finally, deeply, in a way that no amount of being told her worth had ever managed. Understanding that the work itself was the record, not the praise, not the recognition, not even Rowan's honest face looking at her the way he looked at her. Those things were good and real, and she wanted them. But underneath them, more durable than any of them, was the simple fact of what she'd done and what it had produced. You cannot give someone their own worth. They have to find it themselves in the doing of things. And no one can take it from you once you've found it that way, because it's not in anyone else's hands. She knew that the world would keep looking at women the way the world looked at women, measuring them against ideas of what they should be rather than what they were. She knew that a large woman in a town like Pine Crossing would still walk into the dry goods store and feel the particular silence that said she'd been prejudged before she opened her mouth. She knew that there would always be men like Hargrove who saw capability in others and tried to acquire or destroy it rather than face what it meant about their own limits. She knew all of that, and she had made her peace with knowing it, because the alternative, Spending the rest of her life being surprised and wounded by a world that was going to be what it was going to be seemed like a considerable waste of the energy she'd rather put toward the horses. On a Tuesday morning in late August, 3 years and some months after she'd ridden up the mountain with a canvas bag and $22 in change, she was in the high pasture checking the fence line on the northern boundary, the correctly positioned boundary, with its markers documented and legally confirmed, when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to see Rowan coming up on the gray mountain horse that was beginning to show his years, but still moved with the careful, considered step that had caught her attention across a street in Pine Crossing a lifetime ago. He pulled up beside her and looked at the boundary markers. "County surveyor's coming through next week," he said. "Quarterly inspection, standard." "I know," she said. "I scheduled it." "I thought you might have." He looked at the high pasture, the horses dotting the green, Clara among them now. 3 years old, finished, working, exactly what that night's labor had promised she could be. Hargrove sent a note. "He's got a buyer coming up from the capital next month. Railroad money. Wants 6 horses for a mountain survey operation." "We've got 6 suitable," she said. "I'll pull the records this evening." He also said, Rowan paused in the way that meant he was deciding whether something was worth saying. "What?" He said the man from the capital had asked specifically for horses from the Voss operation. Not Hargrove's referral. The man had heard about us separately, through the freight operators. He looked at her. He'd heard there was a woman up here who knew more about mountain horses than anyone in the territory. She looked at the pasture. "Hargrove seemed annoyed about that," Rowan added. "Good," she said. Rowan made the sound that was his laugh. She felt it, familiar now, the way everything about him was familiar now. The specific weight of his presence beside her, the way he held the reins loose in his left hand, the expression he got when something satisfied him, which was what his face was doing right now. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "What?" "Clara's first foal. Next spring, probably, if we breed her this fall." She looked at the filly moving in the far end of the pasture. "I want to use Garnet." He looked at her. "I know," she said. "She's young for it." "She'll be 4 by the time the foal comes," he said slowly. "It's not ideal." "It's not ideal," she agreed. "But Garnet's 13. He's in good health and he's got years left, but he doesn't have unlimited years. Clara has his mother's best traits, and something else besides. The foal those two would produce—" She stopped. "I want to see what that foal becomes." Rowan was quiet for a while. She could feel him thinking through it the way he thought through things, thoroughly, without rushing to the conclusion. "You'd need to monitor Duchess through the gestation," he said. "She'll be anxious about Clara being bred." "I know. And Clara's going to be a difficult mother the first time. She's got too much attention for everything around her. She's going to be distracted." "I know that too," she said. "That's why I'm telling you now instead of spring. We have time to set up the conditions correctly." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. She looked at the mountains, the high white of the permanent snowfields above the tree line, the deep uneven green below, and the horses moving through the afternoon light, the way horses move when nothing is asking anything of them, loosely, with the casual belonging of creatures in their right place. She thought about the $22 under the barn floor in Pine Crossing and whether Pete Daly had found work, and the Grullo gelding she'd spent 6 days starting for a rancher who'd paid her brother and hadn't looked at her while he did it. She thought about her father's voice telling her you can't always save them, but you have to try everything you know. She thought about Gerald, who was managing, from what she'd heard, and who had stopped talking to Hargrove, and who occasionally sent a note through the county post that contained more apology in its practical content than he would ever be able to say directly. She thought about all of that, and set it down, and looked at what was here. The work, which was never finished and always worth doing. The man beside her, imperfect and steady, who had seen her across a paddock fence and done the honest calculation and asked her plainly. The horses, which were the through line of everything, the reason she'd been worth finding, the medium through which she'd proved what she was, the living record of every good decision and every hard-won skill she'd spent her life building. The mountain, which was not kind and had never pretended to be, but which had given her something kinder than kindness, which was the truth of what she was capable of, demonstrated in conditions that didn't lie. She had not fixed everything. She had not solved the world's particular blindnesses or made the people who dismissed her suddenly see clearly. She had not become someone different from who she was in Pine Crossing. She was still large, still practical, still unlikely to be what any periodical described when it talked about women and their lives. She had simply gone to a place where what she actually was turned out to be exactly what was needed. And she had stayed and worked and built something true. Clara lifted her head at the far end of the pasture and looked toward them, toward Beatrice specifically, the way she had since January of her birth year, the specific attention of an animal that has decided one human is the fixed point of its world. She stood there for a moment with the mountains behind her and the afternoon light catching her coat, this horse that should not have lived through that January night, this horse that was the evidence of everything that was possible when you refused to stop before you'd tried everything you knew. Beatrice raised her hand. Clara went back to grazing. Rowan watched this and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying, and that was one of the many things she loved about him. She turned her horse and they rode back down toward the homestead together, through the high green of the summer pasture, into the life they had built from difficult materials and stubborn intention and the willingness to look at each other and themselves and the work in front of them, with the clear and undeceived eyes of people who understood that honest was always better than beautiful, and real was always better than easy. And what you build with your own hands on difficult ground is the only thing in this world that is truly, permanently yours.